What's up guys, this is your favorite fanfic YouTuber, the Fanfic Majesty, and welcome to another amazing video. You can follow me on Patreon for exclusive stories. 4 SHW Kokoyashi Village. 3 questions. We're headed where? How do we do that? Who did this to you? And the bastard did what? The going merry no one's paw of 2 crumpled forms groaned as they pushed themselves up off the deck. Silently the two shared assuring looks to one another. This was just a fluke and it wasn't real combat anyway. In real combat they never would have lost to a woman, even big sis Nami. Nodding to themselves comically, they patted their clothes to rid it off dust before making their way to the kitchen so they could join the Straw Hats for dinner. Johnny paused in his stride however when he noticed the direction they'd taken from the Barati. Wait, no, this can't be right, the only thing in this direction is. Yosaku noticed Johnny's panicked look and asked him what was wrong, but his partner just rushed past him. Thinking he'd been duped, Yosaku angrily called out to Johnny. Bastard, don't you dare take my spinach puffs again. Johnny had a habit of not ordering spinach puffs for dessert for himself but unapologetically ate some, if not most, of Yosaku's back in the Barati. The dark-haired bounty hunter paid no mind to the misunderstanding and just threw open the door to the kitchen. Luffy and the rest of the Straw Hats looking up to the door with raised brows wondering what warranted such an action. Johnny, you good? Luffy asked, eyes shifting around as he widened his range of perception. Was there an intruder on board? Perhaps an enemy pirate ship nearby? Even if you're hungry, that's not a valid reason to slam the door open like that, Sanji reprimanded from his seat next to Nami, the navigator glaring warningly at the man. The look promised another session of pain for his actions and the thought gave Johnny a moment of fright before he remembered why he did such a thing and was overcome with confused anger again. Big sis Nami, do you realize where you've set the course for? Johnny demanded answers. No one in their right mind would be headed there and Nami had to be clueless or just plain stupid if she was sending them to that tyrant bastard's turf. You're sending us towards the Konami Islands, the home turf of. Johnny, you bastard. Yosaku cut Johnny's tirade off by jumping the bounty hunter from behind, sending the two of them crashing towards the table. Sanji was not about to let food be wasted. Slam. Bam. Bloody knob gobblers. Sanji growled under his breath as he stared down at the two bounty hunters he'd slammed into the ground with an axe kick. If you two just plan on making a ruckus then take your share of the food and bugger off. Luffy was quiet for a moment with wide comical eyes before he turned to Nami questioningly. Knob gobbler? Nami entered a coughing fit and pounded her chest to get whatever got stuck up in her airways back down. Across from her Usopp had snorted water out his nose in shock and horror as Luffy seemed to want an explanation on the cuss. Sanji stopped glaring down at the two idiots who were groaning in pain so he could grab some tissues for Usopp. Luffy had gotten up to help Nami out of her predicament so Sanji wasn't given the chance to be a white knight for a fair maiden much to the cook's disappointment. He wasn't going to make moves on her but he wasn't above hoping for compliments because of his chivalry. Big bro Sanji, why? Yosaku whined from his position on top of Johnny who was trying to get the other bounty hunter off. Yo Johnny, chill man, I'm getting off. What's got your panties in a twist anyway? Johnny stood back up and glared at Nami, the action drawing confusion from Yosaku and ire from the male Straw Hats. Nami just raised her eyebrow and gestured for him to just spit out whatever was on his mind. You're sending us towards Sawtooth Arlong, big sis. This a suicide voyage or something? Yosaku snapped his head to Nami in horror as he realized why his partner was so aggravated. I thought he was just after my spinach puffs. Yosaku thought as Nami just blankly stared at Johnny. If you want to face off against that bastard and earn the ire of the other fishmen that's fine but don't drag my partner and I into it. Don't drag big bro Zoro along the ride either for that matter. Yosaku decided to join in the discussion in an equally incensed state before Nami could reply, he's right. I owe a lot to you and even like ya hell of a lot big sis but this is suicide. The two bounty hunters glanced at Usopp, expecting the archer to also jump into the argument in a panic but the archer just seemed mildly concerned and glanced towards Luffy. The wolfman's face was a blank sheet that gave the bounty hunter nothing to work off of while Sanji was openly hostile towards them as he stood between them and Nami. The navigator's glare dissipated into a bored look before she sighed. If you cowardly idiots want to run away, go ahead. The two bounty hunters opened their mouths to argue however Nami just went on with an exasperated expression on her face. Are you both forgetting who's the captain of this crew, outsiders? The two flinched at being referred to as outsiders but instead of thinking about her words and the implications of the answer they just shouted and pointed to Luffy. Yeah, your boyfriend, what about it? They're kidding right? Sanji's anger changed from a raging wildfire to a simmering burn as he pinched his eyes tiredly. Usopp blanched at the two bounty hunters and Nami had one of her eyes twitching periodically as her patience was being snuffed out rapidly. Johnny, Yosaku. The two men looked to Luffy who seemed torn about something and regarded them with a disappointed expression. Who killed Krieg and the majority of his crew again? You. The two answered immediately but continued staring at the wolfman with agitated expressions. The idiots weren't even connecting the dots of the rather blatant implications. What about it? Thud, smack, snap. Usopp planted his face on the table, hard, at the sheer stupidity of the two hunters. Nami was just done and facepalmed in exasperation as she took deep breaths to calm herself. Sanji, whatever modicum of respect he had for the two individuals in front of him crumbled away as the big vein on his forehead popped. Krieg was the strongest man on the East Blue but Arlong is a fishman. The bastard's bounty's higher than Krieg's as well. Johnny said, not understanding why the crew his big bro Zoro joined wasn't getting it. Yosaku didn't join him this time as the small collection of brain cells he had began working overtime trying to figure things out from their point of view. Once he did, he smacked himself in the head. Forget Krieg, Johnny, remember who big bro Luffy stood toe-to-toe against. Yosaku grabbed Johnny by his shoulders and started shaking him much to the Ravenhead's chagrin. Mahawk, Johnny. Dracula motherfucking Mahawk. Silence descended the kitchen as Johnny slowly processed his partner's words. The Straw Hats were just too done with the both of them to care anymore and returned to their meal. Ah, Arlong doesn't stand a chance at all. Big bro Luffy can beat him all day every day. Johnny exclaimed at the top of his lungs inside the closed room, and Luffy had taken off his protective headset when he entered. Boom. Pow. Smack. Crack. Snap. Crunch. Kaboom. Luffy huffed as he threw the two jackasses out the kitchen with the bag of takeout bought for them. Johnny and Yosaku wished Nami had been the one to deal out the punishment now. At least if she had, they wouldn't be tied together like a ribbon. How Luffy managed that they had no idea, and all that was going through Yosaku's mind as tears cascaded down his face was, why was I dragged into this? I wasn't the one who shouted like all hell broke loose. Zoro stood by the door to the men's barracks carrying an empty plate and glass and just stared at the pair for a few moments. The swordsman walked towards them and the two thanked the gods that they'd be freed from this painful position, only to cry in deeper despair when Zoro walked right past them with a disappointed shake of his head. You're both idiots. I heard the yelling from the barracks. Closing and locking the door behind him, Zoro surveyed his crewmates and captain to see the damage. Sanji was irritated but wasn't particularly bothered by the earlier outbursts. Usopp jittered in his spot at the table, anxiousness rolling off him in waves. Luffy was leaning back into his seat with a cold drink pressed against his head, probably to find some comfort against the painful ringing in his ears. Nami was a different case altogether. Outwardly she seemed impassive, unbothered by the interrogation from earlier. Her eyes told a different story. Mind sharing what's got ya down, Nami? Zoro asked while making his way to the sink. His gaze lingering on Sanji for a few moments. And don't act like nothing's wrong. You and I both know that's a lie. Zoro kept his eyes on Sanji, waiting to see if the cook would attempt to play hero again. For a moment it seemed like the blonde would, but while Sanji did set a bone-chilling glare on the green-haired swordsman, he didn't intervene or admonish Zoro. Luffy kept a half-lidded gaze on all of them and seemed content with letting his vice-captain continue. Nami gazed at Zoro with a blank expression before sighing and letting her emotions free. Her expression now deeply troubled as she glanced at Zoro, Sanji and Usopp periodically. She looked down, concern painted clearly on her face. They're right. The navigator glanced at her lover who kept silent and just watched. Aside from Luffy. And maybe Sanji, the next destination is basically a suicide trip. Usopp frowned deeply but made no effort to correct her. The skirmish he had with Jin showed how he still had a lot of catching up to do. Zoro schooled his expression to his go-to-resting bitch face to not give away the anger he felt from feeling insulted. It wouldn't be much of a problem for you either, Zoro, if you were in peak condition. Nami added, knowing she'd likely wounded his pride. For Usopp, there's a few matchups that could work out in his favor but the odds would still be heavily stacked against him. There was a moment of silence before Zoro asked, and you're worried because? The swordsman was lost on why Nami was concerned over something like this now. You didn't voice any protests when I went to duel Mahawk. What's the difference? I'm still risking my life in both cases. Usopp also seemed curious about that and turned to Nami in interest. Sanji and Luffy glanced at each other and both sighed in exasperation internally. The difference is that dueling Mahawk is part of your dream, your journey. Nami responded with a little amused smile, this little detour, it's not even my dream, just a chore I had never got around to doing. Nami couldn't help it. A few tears ran down her cheeks against her will as she continued. Bringing you all along for the ride, only to get you killed, I'm an idiot. Zoro scowled and narrowed his eyes at Nami's self-loathing. I should have just went with Luffy, if you guys ended up not being able to live your dreams because of me I'd. Shut up. Nami's ranting was cut short by Zoro's clear displeasure. Sanji's glare hardened but a warning glare from his captain kept him from interjecting. It's our lives, Nami, and it's up to us on how we live it. If any of us didn't want to help liberate your home we would have said so. Zoro scowled for 1 second longer before his face broke out into a smug smirk. You know I would have been bitchin' a long time ago if I had any problems with dealing with those guppies for ya. Nami seemed at a loss for words when Usopp jumped in and agreed with his vice captain. He's right, Nami, it doesn't matter who it is, if they mess with you they gotta deal with us. True to the marksman's nature, Usopp then struck a smug wise man-like pose and began regaling his crewmates with the time he stood up to a massive carp that came to his village. True to the crew's nature they ignored him. Well, Luffy paid him some attention and nodded along, feigning interest to amuse the archer, but the rest flat out ignored him. Crude delivery but true nonetheless. Sanji stated, throwing in his 2 cents in. Any who harms our family can expect no mercy. Nami, touched by her friends' her family's concern and clear devotion to her, began shedding tears for very different reasons. Sanji and Usopp began panicking and fussing over her while Zoro just laughed and took a seat next to her before ruffling her hair affectionately. The act froze Sanji and Usopp in their tracks but for different reasons. For Sanji, well, Zoro just took his seat and stole his thunder. Comforting women was his job, not the shitty mossheads. In Usopp's case. Zoro. Are you dying? Usopp exclaimed in horror before he eeped and slammed his hands on his mouth as he heard growling behind him. Turning around nervously, Usopp's fears were confirmed as he came face to face with Luffy covering his ears as he glared daggers at the marksman. Thankfully his outburst got Zoro and Nami's attention as the swordsman shot him a confused, and slightly irritated, look while Nami began eyeing Zoro from top to bottom in concern. No, Usopp, I'm not dying. The heck gave you that idea anyway? Zoro questioned while giving Nami headpats to assure he was fine, ignoring Sanji's withering glare. He's probably freaked out by how affectionate you're being. Usually you're a stone-cold battle junkie set on drinking yourself to oblivion. Luffy answered with an amused smile watching the brother-sister dynamic blossoming before his eyes. Why are you so affectionate today anyway? Blood loss and a little tipsy after Arrow Cook's remedy, Zoro stared at Sanji for a few seconds causing the blonde to gaze back with exasperated anger. Dartboard ain't gonna be our doctor, right? Much as I love alcohol, even I know it ain't the solution to every injury. You gave him alcohol. Dude, what the hell? Nope. He's our cook and martial arts instructor, definitely not our doctor. Nami and Usopp glared daggers at the blonde who raised his arms up in surrender. If it was just Usopp, Sanji would have reciprocated the glare, but since Nami was involved he decided to just accept defeat on this one and explain without a fight. The home remedy was made with the intention of giving someone all the nutrients, vitamins and minerals they would need while recovering. Taste was the last thing to be considered, so it wasn't a pleasant beverage to consume. Sanji said as he took the empty plates of his crew over to the sink so he could wash them. Zoro stood up and joined him without a word. Noticed Mosshead here loved his alcohol from all the drinks he ordered in the restaurant and saw the stash in the corner of the room. Alcohol dulls the senses and has quite a powerful kick to it, so I decided to add some in. Just enough to mask the taste though, shitty swordsman wasn't in any danger. Still doesn't make it right. Nami huffed, more than a little miffed about the situation. Ended up tasting tolerable and the pain isn't as bad now. Zoro said with a wry smile. I can actually walk now. Luffy decided to nip it in the bud right then and there before his first mate got any ideas. You're going back and sleeping in the barracks until we arrive in Kokoyashi. Captain's orders. Zoro blanched and opened his mouth to protest only to be cut off by the rest of the crew. Seconded. Agreed. Shitty swordsman. Luffy clutched his sides as he burst out in laughter while Zoro looked at his crew with a betrayed expression. They had for all intents and purposes banned him from his favorite pastime, training. Sorry brother. Tell you what though, once you're fully recovered I'll double down on our sparring sessions. I'll hold you to that. Zoro walked out the kitchen and towards the barracks, resigned to his fate. Nami rolled her eyes at the swordsman's grumbling and Usopp went to help Sanji with the dishes. For a few minutes, Sanji and Usopp bantered with one another about the crew's adventure, Nami joining in from time to fill in the gaps or stop Usopp from diverging too far into his tales. Then Usopp had an epiphany. Have you guys ever noticed how we act like we're actual siblings sometimes? Especially Zoro and Luffy. Usopp asked Nami, not expecting Sanji, the newest crew member, to have any input on this topic. He was wrong. Sanji gave Usopp a confused look. Isn't it only natural? I mean, you did become part of his pack, didn't you? Huh, pack, you mean crew? Usopp asked back, completely lost. Sanji blinked and turned to Luffy. He doesn't know. Luffy shook his head. No, he doesn't. Zoro was supposed to fill him in, but, the Wolfman smiled wryly recalling the scene of Usopp face down and beaten up on the floor after Zoro experienced for the first time the true hell that is a scream in closed rooms. Well, to make this quick, Usopp my devil fruit is the Inu Inu no Mi model. For a few moments there was silence, then Nami began to observe Usopp nervously. The marksman hadn't been left dumbfounded or in fright like everyone else had so far. Usopp was just quietly staring at Luffy, blinking with uncomprehending eyes. Usopp, you okay? The navigator stood up and shook the marksman's shoulder, who turned to her with a furrowed brow. Yeah, who or what's a clatter? A plate slipped out of Sanji's hand and clattered against the others still in the sink, thankfully not breaking, as the cook's cigarette fell out his mouth. Why, you're kidding, right? Sanji asked, staring at Usopp incredulously. The monster wasn't just some random beast from a small-time cult following, it was a freaking legend in the North Blue, for God's sakes. How could the guy who spouts off on and on about the most out there stories not know one of the most famous mythological creatures in existence? No, Usopp answered unsurely, under the impression he was about to get decked by the cook. It's a cool name, but I don't recognize it. Nami, Sanji and Luffy all just stared. There wasn't anything else they could do but stare, until Sanji sighed and began sharing the tale of the monster known as the Devourer. 30 minutes later and the world was all good again, at least to Sanji and Nami. Usopp, in his shell-shocked state, had forgotten the most basic fundamental rule on the ship. No yelling in closed spaces. Bonk. With a steaming bump on his head, Usopp kneeled before Luffy, shivering under the wolfman's scathing look. You're going to get an additional training session for the next few weeks, Usopp. Luffy promised darkly with a smile that was anything but friendly. Personal training sessions. Usopp began crying and whimpering to Nami for mercy, begging her to calm the captain down and alleviate his punishment. Yeah, no, she wasn't interested. Why do you forsake me, Nami? Why? The navigator just rolled her eyes as Usopp continued his dramatic display. Sanji, wiping his hands clean by the sink as he finally finished with the dishes, turned to Luffy to bring the topic back up. So are Usopp and I welcome to join the pack now, or is there a prerequisite? Luffy glanced at Sanji for a moment, then at Usopp before resting his gaze on his fiancée. How long till we get to Kokoyashi? 2 days. One if the winds become favorable, Nami answered as she looked out the window longingly. Well I might as well give you both the tools for the job so you can take out the trash expeditiously. Luffy stood up from his seat and stretched, his bones audibly popping. Aight, let's do this. Luffy's jaw twitched and, with a loud snap, his canines lengthened, and Usopp fainted. Thud. Well I guess that means I'm going first. Sanji nonchalantly walks to Luffy, purposefully and unapologetically stepping on Usopp on the way, and presents his arm. It doesn't have to be on the neck, right? Luffy sighed and rubbed his eyes together. This again? For fuck's sakes, I'm not giving you or Zoro or anyone aside from my wives a mate mark. As the wolfman sank his teeth into Sanji's arm, spiderweb-like cracks began spreading outwards much like with Zoro when the first mate had joined the pack, stopping once it encompassed nearly half of Sanji's body. Letting go of his cook's arm, Luffy walked over to the sink to spit out the blood that had entered his mouth and gargled water to wash any residual traces out. All right, someone hold Usopp down so he doesn't struggle too much when I bite him. Got it. Sanji pinned Usopp to the ground by his limbs with the exception of the archer's right arm which Nami presented to Luffy. The wolfman laughed internally at how Nami was holding Usopp's hand up to him like it was a treat. Carrot, I told you not to mess with my stuff. Put down the glitter bomb onion. The marksman's slurred words drew confused yet amused smirks from his conscious crewmates. Then Usopp's eyes shot wide open the moment Luffy's fangs penetrated his skin. Mons MMPHM. Knowing it would hurt her beloved's sensitive ears, Nami clamped her free hand over Usopp's mouth. Maybe she also did it a little for the marksman as well, feeling a tad sorry for the guy. And guilty for leaving him to fend for himself against the sadistic bastard that is her boyfriend. The spider web-like cracks spread on Usopp as well, glowing like moonlight. The scene was so surreal to the archer that he'd stopped struggling so he could watch. Nami had a similar reaction but was more curious if the process would be the same for her. She wasn't exactly going to just be a standard member of the pack after all. Sanji looked like he wanted another smoke. And Luffy, who noticed, was beginning to seriously worry about his cook's smoking addiction. If you ban him from cigarettes, you'd need to ban Zoro from alcohol as well. Right when I thought you'd be quiet for once. Am I wrong, though? Single quote. Shut up, you overgrown chihuahua. Chihuahua, how dare you? Apologize. No. While Luffy had his tennis match with the wolf within, he released Usopp's arm and returned to the sink to freshen up. The marksman stood back up with the help of Sanji, who decided to ask more about the crew's adventures till this point. Glad to be in his element yet again, Usopp happily shared what he knew. Nami smiled happily seeing the two getting along before noticing Luffy gesturing for them to leave. With a nod the two left the cook and the archer to themselves, and when they reached the door Nami noticed the look in Luffy's eyes and smiled darkly. Our bedroom. Luffy confirmed with a twisted smile as his eyes were alit with mirth. Damn pup, I said apologize, I'm not shutting up until you do. Alright, I'm sorry, that didn't sound sincere at all. I'm sorry but I am very sincere, I swear. Luffy did a mental arm raise. Scout's honor. You've never even been a scout, you cheeky CU. Inside the privacy of their own bedroom, Nami locked the door behind her as Luffy brought out the black Den Mushi Mihawk had given him earlier that day. Puru Casey hack. Hello. A gruff man's voice came out the black snail's mouth, its expression a glare with an open frown. This is my private number, so who is? Good afternoon, Gramps. Luffy grinned cheekily when the black snail blinked before it split into a wide shit-eating grin. Nami from her seat sweat dropped at how eerily similar it was to Luffy's own. Mihawk got the Den Mushi this morning, how've ya been? Wahahahaha. I'm healthy as a horse if that's what you're asking. Just finished re-educating that Margaret prick you told me about in Shell's Town actually. Met the new recruit you sent my way as well, or Kirby was it? Nami and Luffy both sweat dropped at how Garp butchered the two individuals' names. You mean Morgan and Kobe? Luffy felt bad for the kid already. Huh? Oh yeah, Kobe, that was it. Cheeky brat had another recruit with him, that wimpy son of that scum Mildew. Nami raised her eyebrow at the new name and glanced at Luffy questioningly. The navigator wondered if Garp was changing the bastard of a marine captain's name on purpose or genuinely just didn't care enough to learn it. It was both. So why'd y'all call? Got another marine for me to re-educate already. The snail was smiling jovially as it delivered Garp's message, but the eyes were anything but sunshine and rainbows. Not this time, no. Well, I guess there was that guy from earlier, but, Nami, you think pink hair needs re-educating? Luffy turned to his girlfriend to get her opinion only to find the navigator looking like a deer caught in headlights. Babe, Babe? My grandson has a girlfriend? Oh, Luffy's poor ears. The wolfman's eyes became swirls as he flopped onto the bed, the black snail's expression becoming panicked as it flew up in the air. Screw keeping up professional appearances. If he was gonna die, it was gonna be with his real emotions expressed on its face, not a raving grandpa's. Idiot. Nami jumped out of her seat and dove for the snail, catching it right before it hit the ground. She let out a pained grunt when she slammed down on the ground, the snail following her expression of pain now that he was out of danger. Thank you, beautiful Oranget. The snail screamed internally, returning to a professional standards now that it was out of danger. Luffy, be careful, you clumsy puppy. Who is this? My grandson's girlfriend? The snail glared down at Nami, who gulped as she readjusted herself. cursing her boyfriend who was still disoriented from the sudden scream earlier. My grandson can't date yet. He's 20 years too young to be dating. I forbid it. No girl aside from one that could keep him in check will ever have my blessings. Never. Sir, after 20 years, Luffy would be 37. An exasperated voice said from the snail, but the expression hadn't changed from the angry one from earlier. And a woman who could keep your grandson in check. Sir, I say this with all due respect, but if he's got even a shred of your DNA, no woman in the world would be able to keep him in check. Huh. His mother would. That woman scares the living shit out of even someone like me. Garp guffawed as he rebuked his companion. Nami's sweat dropped internally, questioning if that was something he should sound proud of when she registered his words. Wait, mother. If it's someone even Garp's afraid of, then it can't be Dayton. Luffy said his adoptive mother was basically Garp's go-to babysitter for himself and his brothers. His mother? I thought you said she went missing? The sound of a person scratching his head was heard over the call as Garp coughed anxiously as he had messed up somewhere. Ah, yes, that dear daughter-in-law of mine has indeed gone missing, wahaha, but if she was still around she'd beat the shit out of me and Luffy any day of the week. Woman was even able to keep that son of mine in check while they were together after all. Nami frowned. Garp was clearly hiding something, and a glance from Luffy confirmed that her boyfriend was still out of commission, so she couldn't ask him about it, if he even knew that is. Luffy's never mentioned his mother. He told me about his biological father but not about her. I thought she wasn't with us anymore. Nami wondered if Luffy even knew his biological mother was alive. The Wolfman was never ashamed to say who his family was. He was never ashamed to admit almost anything actually. Nami recalled how he'd confessed to mostly seeing his biological father as nothing but donor. Harsh, but she sees why. To Luffy, Shanks was his real father, and that man was more like an uncle than a dad. So if Luffy never told her about his mother, there was a good chance even he didn't know she was alive. Anyway, is this Luffy's girlfriend? Garp questioned, the snail gritting its teeth angrily. Nami was beginning to wonder if there was anyone from Luffy's family, adopted or otherwise, who was sane or normal aside from Makino. Yes, Sir Garp, this is her. My name is Nami and I'm the navigator for his crew, and I am able to keep him in line. Adding that last part with a smug smile, Nami observed the snail's expression turn to one of doubt and apprehension. Keep him in line? Wahahaha. His father will become a marine before someone manages to tame Lu. I threatened to cut down his meals and refuse to offer him any affections when he doesn't behave. So far he's been a very obedient pup. Nami purred like a cat who just found a new toy to torment. Do I fill up your requirements now, or should I have Luffy at my beck and call when we meet in my hometown? Meet in your hometown? Why would I do that? Garp decided to ignore the rest of the frightening sadistic woman's speech to focus on that detail. Fortunately for him, and for Nami, that's what she was really after. The 16th branch in the East Blue, responsible for the Konami Islands and thus my hometown Kokoyashi village. Dot has been in league with the former Sun Pirate Sawtooth Arlong for the past 8 years as he terrorized and took control over my home. Killing my mother, former Marine Officer Belmere, before putting me to work for him since I was 10 as his navigator. Nami knew better than to wait for Garp's outburst, so she continued by sharing Luffy's new plan. Sawtooth Arlong is the sword brother of Warlord Jimbei. Luffy and I have a favor to ask you, grandfather. From there Nami elaborated further on what Luffy had planned and the technicalities of their situation that allowed for certain exceptions. As time went on and Garp listened more and more to Nami, the old Vice Admiral began to realize the similarities between the navigator and his missing daughter-in-law. The cold, twisted, thinly veiled sadism, the lack of regard for limits or breaks when it came to vengeance. The clear love and devotion she had for her family. Towards the end the talk between Garp and Nami turned into one that families had around the dinner table. The Vice Admiral as the father meeting and bonding with the lovely girl his son, well grandson, brought home. Wahahaha. An all-out paint war. Haha. That's my grandson. Nami could hear the groaning in the background. Sounds like Bogard was recalling a rather unpleasant memory. The navigator giggled as Garp shared memories of Luffy and his brothers growing up. One that had her gasping for air was the time the 3 children had somehow glitterbombed the whole area of their adoptive mother's house. That old hag was pulling her hair out trying to clean up after the mess. Wahahaha. Nami laughed along with the Vice Admiral as the Wolfman still laying on the bed finally seemed to come to. Groaning, Luffy sat up on the bed and clutched his head with a pained expression. Nami gave him a sympathetic smile. She may not have sensitive hearing yet, but Garp wasn't exactly quiet by normal human standards either. You all right there, Lu? Yeah I guess. Fuck, Gramps' screams hit like a fucking truck. In response to Luffy's pained complaints, the Den Den Mushi huffed and scowled disappointingly. TCH, cheeky brat, you should have come up with ways around that weakness by now. Luffy glared at the snail that shivered slightly under the glare but retained its imitation of Garp's expression. Internally the snail was screaming. Or you could learn to keep your voice down to normal people's standards. The wolfman's scathing look was causing the snail's heart to pump like never before. Poor thing was probably gonna die young if it had to keep living under that look. Bah, who wants to be a normal chump? I'm out for number 1. Number 1 asshole. You got that title a long time ago, Gramps. The snail's eyes became pure white and popped out shark teeth before responding. What was that, you cheeky brat? I'll re-educate you when we meet again. Luffy raised his eyebrow at that and turned to his fiancée who'd been quietly chuckling to herself watching the two interact. You caught him up to speed already. And he agreed. Ha, course I did. Anything my granddaughter-in-law wants, she need only ask. Luffy blanched at the snail who looked smug as it delivered Garp's words, internally thanking the snail gods above that the scary pirate captain wasn't glaring at him like he wanted to crush him anymore. Nami didn't bother holding in her laughter and let loose as she gave Luffy a kiss on his cheek, throwing her arms around his neck affectionately. Grandfather approves of me, Luffy. The wolfman just stared at her like she was some alien creature that just offered him a trip to the world of endless screaming. What the hell did you do to Gramps? What the heck did you say? The normally composed pirate captain lost all his marbles. Garp didn't like any woman around his age anywhere near him growing up. Ace's first girlfriend, chased away by Garp wielding trees like dual blades. Sabo's first admirer. There wasn't a mountain of boulders the day before. The first girl who had a crush on Luffy. Dear Lord, even Makino was openly hostile to Garp for how he dealt with that situation. Luffy wasn't blind. He knew what kind of person his fiancé was. Greed incarnate. The kind of people Garp tended to immediately shove into a cannon and fire away no matter how many times Sengoku reprimanded him for it. How in God's name did Nami get in Garp's good graces? I have you on a tight leash. Nami, his beautiful girlfriend said oh so sweetly, before fixing the cold sadistic look that promised pain if he did anything to annoy her. Isn't that right, my love? Yep, tight leash. Real tight. Absolutely and unequivocally tight. Garp laughed his ass off hearing his grandson's abrupt submission. Was he stronger than her? Yes. Was he so much stronger that it's pathetic that I bend to her will so much? Yes. Was he afraid regardless and just let her have free rein for the most part? Yep. Shut up, wolf. You aren't any better. Thou chi. It's touche, dumbass. Kokoyashi village. No one's pav. A tanned woman sighed as she kneeled on a cliff's edge. In front of her was a cross, a grave, overlooking the ocean. A vase of wilted flowers in between the woman and the cross. She's cutting it real close this time, Mom. The tanned woman said as she began removing the dead flowers from the vase, the ocean winds breezing past causing her light blue hair to sway. The woman wore a beige sleeveless shirt, blue trousers, and purple sandal, her right arm and chest bearing many tattoos. That little orange Spitfire's still as reckless as ever. The grave remained silent to the woman's attempt at striking up a conversation. It continued to be unresponsive as tears began to fall down onto the ground. The woman's form shook as she let a few more tears slip past before putting her walls back up. This wasn't the time to break down into a sobbing mess. That could come later when the nightmare finally came to an end. The thought brought a smile to the woman's face. Nami probably decided to take a bit longer so she could make this her final expedition. The woman chuckled to herself while placing new flowers in the vase. Stupid girl, if she carries that much plunder in one go it'll be too suspicious for Marines to just ignore. The woman smiled sadly as she watched the sun begin its descent beneath the waves, the sky changing to a beautiful breathtaking orange. Like her hair, and our tangerines. You all right there, Najiko? The young blue-haired woman looked behind her to see an older man in a maroon police uniform with a pinwheel attached to the top of his hat. It was the sheriff of her village, Genzo. The man who was also her and her little sister's adoptive father, heavily scarred from when Arlong arrived, given to him by the sawtooth shark fisherman's right-hand man, Karubi. Genzo noticed Nojiko staring at his stitches again and sighed but made no attempt at reprimanding or discouraging her from it. He'd realized it was pointless after the 50th time he'd caught her doing so. Instead he walked closer, bottles of beer in his hands, Bellmare's favorite brand. Nojiko's eyes flicked to the bottle and she smiled as the older man kneeled next to her, offering one bottle to her after opening it. Need a drink? I thought fathers were supposed to chase away bad influences, not be them. Nojiko teased with a cheeky grin. Her spirits lifted now that she had the company of someone she held dear. Genzo scoffed at her and grinned at the cross. Your mother was the worst influence of all, kiddo. You and your sister are gonna be delinquents no matter what I do. Even after all these years, he could still picture Bellmare's shark-toothed protests as she violently proved him wrong by whacking him with whatever she had handy. Nojiko burst out in laughter having similar thoughts as she took a swig of her beer. She's sure taking her sweet time with this latest run. Nojiko's smile dimmed slightly but she was still more upbeat than when she was alone. Yeah, I think she wants to make this her last run. Genzo glanced at his adopted eldest daughter and noted the bags under her eyes. No one would have noticed unless they were, like him, right next to her. Worrying about it won't make the problem go away, if anything it'll just make you feel worse. His uncharacteristically wise response drew a raised brow from Nojiko who smiled wryly at him. Dr. Neko lay in Anya again. Genzo opened his mouth to deny her claims but Nojiko smirked and continued, I know my father isn't bright enough to say something like that. All his brain cells are dedicated elsewhere. Genzo and Nojiko stared each other down before the sheriff finally folded and confirmed that the good doctor had indeed laid in on him earlier. The young woman got a kick out of her father being reprimanded for being such a worrywart and decided to tease him a bit. She might also be taking her time cause she found someone, you know. The sheriff stiffened and turned to Najiko, twitching like a robot about to explode. The woman knew exactly how to push his buttons and this was one of the easiest and most triggering one of them all. Might have had a fun night or two. Genzo looked ready to erupt at the very thought of someone laying a hand on his adopted daughter. Or three. Maybe even had more than one partner, one wild night be. No, never. I forbid it. Genzo lost all his marbles and shot straight up from his kneeling position to start raving. Too incensed to notice Nojiko desperately trying to conceal her laughter. In her sadness. While her father figure continued his tirade, she gazed longingly at the cross and wondered to herself, like she had many times before, for the past 10 years. How different would her life be if Belmere never died? Would Nami never have lost that innocent happy light in her eyes? Would the two still quarrel day in and day out over the littlest of things? Would they have made up after that last fight? Eventually Nojiko realized Genzo was no longer ranting and she turned to him wondering why he was being quiet again. Between her and Genzo was a box of tissues. Confused, she remained where she kneeled as Genzo took a few sheets and began wiping her cheeks, that she now realized were wet. She'd begun shedding tears without realizing. With shaky breaths, she calmed herself down and stood up, offering a hand to the old sheriff to help him up. Genzo smiled and accepted, standing up with her as he opened the third and last bottle he brought with him and poured it on Belmere's grave. Be kind of mean if I just left it above her grave, wouldn't it? Though phrased like a question, Nojiko knew it wasn't one. The young woman giggled, knowing her mother would have clocked Genzo for not giving her the beer. The woman had gotten mad when the sheriff had taken her away from bars a lot when she was still with them. Things will be all good from here on forward, Nojiko. When Nami gets back, let's all go out for a bite to eat. My treat. Nojiko scoffed, it would be on the house to begin with, cheapskate. The sheriff blanched at her and denied her claims as they walked away from the grave and towards her home. The mood was light and cheery again. A feeling she wanted to feel for the rest of her life, but most importantly, a mood she wished Nami would have after finally being free from this nightmare. Nojiko learned these thoughts were nothing more than a naive child's foolish dreams. The next day, a day before her sister was due for arriving, the Marines came. They came to her home, ravaged her mother's tangerine orchard, and took away all her sister's hard work. The young woman and the sheriff were stuck where they were left. The old man was trashed and beaten by the Marines after he tried to stop them from taking his adoptive daughter's plunder, left battered and bruised against the house's front door. Nojiko clutched her sides in pain, the Marine captain having shot her in fear when she rushed towards him. Her older sister, shot and in pain as her father figure leaned against her family home black and blue. This was how Nami found her family again not too long after the Marines had left. All the joy she felt over the winds granting her wish to come home sooner was gone as she stood before her mother's ruined orchard. We tried, Nami. I swear, we did. Nojiko's eyes streamed with tears as the tall man with a straw hat who'd accompanied her sister cauterized her bullet wound with a heated blade. She didn't know how he'd done it and she wasn't lucid enough to question it. The green-haired swordsman and blonde man in a suit took Genzo inside and worked on administering first aid for the old sheriff. Usopp worked in the kitchen to make a salve he'd learned to make over the years after getting himself cut and scratched in all his adventures back on syrup. I'm so sorry, Nami. You worked so hard for the money to save us, and we couldn't even keep it safe. Fuck the money. Nami growled out through her gritted teeth as she trembled with fury seeing the state of her mother's orange grove. Those bastards have gone too far. Fuck leaving alive for grandfather, I'm killing them myself. The young navigator glanced at her captain, expecting disappointment or protest, but the wolfman's face was just a blank sheet as he lifted the unconscious Nojiko off the ground. His eyes, however, they were bright gold and burned brighter than she'd ever seen them before. Nami had seen what Luffy became like when he saw others treating their own crews, their own families like shit. Now she's witnessing how he reacts to his family being hurt. You won't do it right, the wolfman said softly but firmly as he gently lowered Nami's older sister onto the couch. The wolfman stood and faced his navigator with the same blank face, no trace of fear despite being in her scathing gaze. You'll probably just start bashing their heads in. Maybe break some of their bones one at a time. Castrate a few perhaps? The options given all seemed very novel to Nami, but Luffy acted like the choices were nothing more than a child sentenced to sit in the corner. Do you know what's one of the best kinds of vengeance, my love? The captain walked towards, not waiting for an answer and not expecting one either. One of the best kinds of vengeance is like dragging someone down with you to the depths of the sea, releasing them just in time for them to be able to get that sliver of sweet, lung-filling, life-giving air. Luffy cupped Nami's cheek and pushed back a stray strand of hair as he gazed deep into her cold eyes, normally vibrant and full of life. Now remaining of nothing but wrath. Only to pull them back in just as they're about to break through the surface. Kokoyashi Village, 2. The nightmare ends. Nami stared blankly into the wolfman's piercing gaze, impassive for a few beats. Then she captured his lips as she jumped him right there in her living room. Of all the reactions he was expecting, his girlfriend starting a makeout session with him was not one of them. Out of habit he had reached for her thighs to balance the two of them as she crossed her legs over his waist, pressing against him even harder. Is this woman right in the head? You and I are agreeing on something. The world's coming to an end. Noticing the lack of a response, Nami pulled away and pouted at Luffy, adorably. What's wrong? Luffy just stared back at her incredulously. How was jumping him after sharing sadistic tendencies normal? Nami. I just depicted torture. How is jumping into a makeout session a valid response? The navigator stared at her lover irritably and opened her mouth to respond but quickly shut it and suddenly started struggling to get away from him. Startled, the captain set her down and eyed her like she was a strange creature. Not horrifying or disgusting, just weird. That was when he picked up on the scent. Congratulations. Your fiancé is as fucked up as you are. Shut up. She isn't fucked up, she was just aroused from depictions of grade as sadistic torture. The only question now is if she wants to be holding the whip or be the one bound in chains while you. Please stop. It's your fault I did that, Nami suddenly declared, pointing at Luffy accusingly. The wolfman gaped at her, wondering how in the hell she found a way to pin this on him. You shouldn't say such stupid, sexy things if you don't want to have me all over you. The wolfman was speechless. Where the fuck did his normally level-headed rational girlfriend go, and who was this? This? He didn't even have the words to describe this Nami look-alike before him. Getting aroused and jumping on me. Accusing me with nonsensical explanations. What's next? You're gonna ask me to bend you over and make you nothing more than a depraved bondage mess? The navigator turned bright red and looked like she was going to protest immediately, much to Luffy's relief. The wolfman wasn't sure how to feel about having a masochist as a girlfriend. But when no words came from her lips and she instead seemed to take his words into consideration, the wolfman was filled with gut-wrenching dread. Don't say it. Do not say it. Actually, that sounds kind of hot. You just had to open your mouth, didn't you? While the navigator drifted off into daydreams of Luffy breaking her in, said wolfman looked like his soul had just left his body. The silence between the two was broken when Usopp frantically called out to Nami. The panic and urgency in the marksman's voice instantly broke the navigator out of her dreams, and she quickly made her way over to the bedroom where the rest of the crew had taken Genzo. Luffy quickly followed her but remained outside the room, since there wasn't any space left for him. This is actually a pretty small home, isn't it? Cozy, quaint, must have been a real nice place to grow. You must be truly desperate to be coming to me for escape. While Luffy continued his internal panicking and mortification over the latest kink to be revealed about his girl, Usopp explained why he'd urgently called Nami over. The sheriff needs a doctor. Fast, Usopp said with a seriousness in his eyes Nami wasn't accustomed to seeing the marksman. The deviation would have been a welcome one if it didn't involve why her adoptive father who'd been beaten black and blue wasn't the catalyst for it. Usopp gestured to the deep purple patches spread around the sheriff's torso area with sections turning a sickly yellow and explained that instead of normal no need to worry bruises, these were signs of heavy internal bleeding. Paired with the fact the sheriff was now comatose, Zoro and Sanji had tried waking him up but had no such luck, and were sweaty and cold to the touch, it was clear the man was hemorrhaging. Is there anyone in the village who's? Dr. Neko is the resident doctor in our village, Nami said as she held Genzo's hand while staring at her father figure worriedly for a few moments longer before turning to Zoro. Send Johnny and Yosaku to the village to look for him. Once the villagers start hearing those two calling for help, Dr. Neko will notice before long. The swordsman nodded before he walked out the room, electing to completely disregard the faint scent that had begun wafting through the air. Sanji hadn't reached the level of enhanced smell yet, so he was relatively safe and Usopp was too focused on Genzo to notice. On the way to the door, the swordsman noticed his captain sitting outside the room he'd just left, contemplating something with that vicious look in his eyes. Well, it has been a while since I've eaten sashimi. Wonder what sashimi made from fishmen tastes like. Zoro recalled one of the more friendly moments he'd had with Kuina. The girl and her father had brought him along with them to eat lunch in a sushi tent. Shame, Nami's friends with the only octopus fishman here. Teiko Nigiri was one of our favorites, wasn't it, Kuina? Luffy glanced briefly at his first mate whose eyes became unfocused, a small visual cue that Luffy had learned usually meant he'd remembered something from his past. Likely something to do with his childhood friend. Zoro never told Luffy her name, but it was clear that whoever she was, she meant a lot to the swordsman. Even if she was no longer with them. Just as the swordsman returned after giving Johnny and Yosaku their mission, the tanned woman Luffy had carried inside began to stir. Upon meeting Zoro's gaze from the doorway, she immediately jumped up and assumed a defensive stance, only to flinch and hunch over slightly as her wounded side screamed in protest. Nonetheless, she put her hands before her and clenched her fists while sizing up the green-haired man. Who are you? What are you doing in my house? Nijiko demanded answers from the swordsman, who just raised an eyebrow at her, mildly impressed. His name is Roronoa Zoro, formerly a bounty hunter. Now he's the vice-captain of my crew. Luffy became the focus of Nijiko's attention now that he made his presence known. The tanned woman turned so she could keep the both of them in her sights, unsure of what they might do next. My name is Monkey D. Luffy, captain of the crew. And your brother-in-law. I don't care who you are, pirate. If you came here to pillage, you're a bit too low-weight, brother-in-law. The two men smiled and chuckled over the woman's delayed reaction. Poor girl was probably only able to stand and ignore the pain because of the adrenaline coursing through her system. Nami got married? Said navigator exited the bedroom and promptly delivered a hockey-coated fist onto Luffy's head. We aren't married yet, sis. My fiancé here is just very eager. Fiancé? What is going on? Nijiko's high-pitched scream caused Zoro and Luffy to wince. Explain yourself. Feeling bad for her fiancé and older brother, Nami gave Nijiko a quick rundown of the story as they nursed their ringing ears. She met Luffy in one of her pirate ship pillaging runs. The man had hopped aboard her ship with a boy named Kobe just as the Navy began sinking Alvida's vessel. From there they traveled to Shell's Town. Nami was on the hunt for the map of the Grand Line supposedly kept in Axe-Hand Morgan's vault, and Luffy was there for a new ship as well as scouting for potential crewmates. In Shell's Town they met Zoro, freed him from the corrupt marine captain, and put an end to Morgan's tyranny. After saying goodbyes to Kobe, the three set off to Orange Town where the infamous Buggy the Clown had taken residence in. The pirate had stolen the map of the Grand Line before Nami had, and since Luffy was interested in meeting one of his father's old crewmates, the orange-haired woman came along for the ride. In Orange Town they met an old mayor trying to keep his town safe and the bravest little dog they'd ever known. When Luffy was done wreaking havoc amongst the buggy pirates, he found her and struck a deal with her. Nami was to join his crew and become its navigator. And to be his wife. The village threw a party in honor of them for freeing them from the buggy pirates' clutches. The next adventure took them to a little peaceful town named Syrup Village, and Nami was about to introduce Usopp, but the sudden appearance of a certain elderly gentleman in a doctor's coat and bandana cut her off. "Where is the old bastard? I got these two numbskulls carrying the equipment behind me," the newcomer said, presumably Dr. Neko. Throughout the story, Nami and Najiko had moved to the couch to discuss amongst themselves while Luffy and Zoro were in the kitchen tweaking bits and pieces of the plan. Upon seeing Dr. Neko, Najiko immediately took him with her to the still unconscious Genzo. "Damn Marines. Damn Arlong. I swear I'm ripping them new ones for this." Najiko shared the enraged doctor's sentiments, but her focus was more on her adoptive father as Johnny and Yosaku came in with the medical equipment and supplies. Usopp exited the room once he saw the doctor, and Sanji followed quietly after. "Do you want to stay, Nami?" Sanji asked while observing Dr. Neko preparing needles and bags of liquids. "We can have everything ready for you by the time your dad's in the clear." Nami shook her head and started walking out the house. "I want to see how it is from this angle." "This angle being?" Usopp prompted, keeping the excess salve he'd made in his bag. The navigator eyed the concoction the whole time it was out. "The angle where I get to see that arrogant oversized guppy be the one to lose everything," Nami replied to a chorus of ahs and HMMs. As the group quietly made their way down the hill, leaving the bounty hunter duo to help out in the house, Nami couldn't help but ask, "Where'd you learn to make that? The salve, I mean?" Upon being brought up, the archer brought out the concoction once more. "Oh, this? Well, you see, Usopp paused, seeing the deadpan looks he was getting from his crew, and coughed before giving them the real answer. "I got in so many accidents back on the island, the local doctor ended up teaching me how to make it. Said he doesn't want to see me in his clinic unless it was above black and blue bruises levels." "Yeah, I could see that," Luffy said offhandedly, Zoro nodding along to show his agreement. Sanji and Nami rolled their eyes. Only Usopp could end up in a doctor's clinic so many times to end up being banned unless it was actually serious. "Want me, the great Usopp, to teach you guys how to make it?" Usopp offered while gesturing grandly to himself, prompting more eye-rolling. But some consideration from Nami as well. The three other men on the other hand immediately declined, with Zoro taking the cake for the most reckless and idiotic. "I watched you make it. Got a good idea on how to tweak it as well, so I'm good," Sanji said with a pondering look in his eyes, probably doing some of the tweaking as they walked to the village. Luffy picked his nose with his pinky as he answered, a family habit Nami was not pleased to learn about but came to accept, or rather begrudgingly tolerate. "Don't need it. Aside from genetics, I also got greater regeneration speed because of my fruit. 20 bottles of sake and a night of sleep, I'll be a-okay the following day." Zoro's response got Sanji and Usopp to immediately smack the swordsman upside the head. "That's not sleeping, that's passing out, you idiot swordsman." "Geez, we know you're a battle junkie, but this?" Usopp shook his head exasperatedly. "Luffy may have his monk moments, but I'm pretty sure you just regressed in the evolutionary line." Zoro scowled at them before scoffing and turning to Luffy, expecting to see some support, only to see the wolfman blankly staring back at him. Then Luffy spoke. And Zoro felt like his world came crashing down. No more drinking and smoking aboard the ship. Captain's orders. Now Sanji was doubly pissed, after briefly descending into horrid depression, and started shouting at the swordsman, blaming the swordsman for costing him his smoking privileges. Zoro didn't respond. His soul had yet to return to his body. Literally. Usopp was jumping around in panic trying to get the soul back in Zoro's body as Luffy screamed in horror, thinking he went too far. A few steps away from the four men stood Nami, sweat dropping at her crew's antics. "I'm surrounded by idiots." After Usopp finally succeeded in returning Zoro's soul into the swordsman's body, the pirate crew resumed their trek down to the village. Zoro and Sanji begged Luffy to reconsider, but the wolfman was steadfast on fixing their habits one way or another. In the end, Luffy decided that instead of banning their favorite life-reducing activities, he'd instead limit them on how much they can indulge themselves with such acts. When Usopp brought up whether or not the limits remained during celebrations, the wolfman stared at him like he was crazy. "Of course they can drink and smoke to their heart's content if it's a celebration. I'm not that evil." The cook and first mate sighed in relief while the navigator was torn between praising her lover for being considerate or reprimanding her captain for being an idiot. Before any more banter could be shared among the group, Zoro and Luffy's heads both snapped towards the village. Knowing what the action usually meant, the other three pirates tensed, preparing themselves for a fight. "The main ingredient in the village, Luffy?" Sanji asked, lighting a new cigarette, expecting to not have the luxury of doing so very soon. "I'm still making shark fin soup, right?" "No, well, I mean yes to the soup, but Arlong isn't there," Luffy said, his posture relaxing but his eyes remained alert. "The town sounds like it's about to revolt. I can hear someone rallying the other villagers to attach the fences. Attack the fishman. They're rallying up to face the fishmen themselves," Luffy said with a grimace. Sending Johnny and Yosaku probably wasn't the best idea. The two couldn't keep their mouths shut if their lives depended on it. The dismal clown duo struck again. Nami frowned and mentally promised herself to pay those two gossip queens a visit after all this was over. Let's get over there before they get themselves all killed. The navigator ordered, not waiting for the others as she already began running down the hill. The others weren't far behind. The monster trio quickly sped up the process as Zoro threw Usopp over his shoulder and Luffy picked up Nami in a bridal carry. Sanji sped past them all to reach the village exit that led to the fisherman's home turf. Luffy. This is. Actually faster. Onward, my steed. Nami commanded with one hand around Luffy's neck to stabilize herself and the other pointing towards the mass of villagers crowding in front of Sanji. Oh, how the mighty have fallen, from her boyfriend to her mule. Shut up, No, by the time the other Straw Hats arrived by the exit, the crowd of villagers were ready to riot and run Sanji right over. Who the hell do you think you are? Do you have any idea what we've been through? This is outrageous. Amidst all this, Sanji calmly smoked his cigarette, atop a pile of unconscious men. Dude. What the hell? Usopp reproached the cook. Yeah, they needed to stop the villagers from going on a suicide mission, but they didn't need to beat them up themselves. You weren't supposed to hurt them, jackass. These guys rushed me first. It was just self-defense. Sanji replied coolly, much to the archer's irritation. Usopp moved to continue their spat, but Nami grabbed his shoulder and shook her head. While I don't like it, Sanji did the best he could do. Those guys under him are the most stubborn people in the village. Nami explained, her voice catching the villagers' attention. What stopped the villagers from crying out her name in shock was the stupor they found themselves in seeing the orange Spitfire in a bridal carry. Hello everyone. Resident thief and traitor extraordinaire, Nami has returned. Nami. Who are these people? And why are you in that man's arms? One of the lead rioters questioned, eyeing Luffy with hostility. They're my crew and this man is my fiancé, Nami said matter-of-factly, Luffy putting her down but keeping her close by his side as the crowd slowly processed her words. Zoro and Luffy, already having a good idea of what was about to happen, quickly brought out their noise-canceling headphones. Sanji and Usopp were not so fortunate. Fiancé. Now the problem wasn't a yelling in general. They were all out in the open so the sound wouldn't bounce around, amplifying itself. Unfortunately, unlike every other time this has happened, there were women involved in the screaming. Usopp and Sanji learned the hard way that women reach notes most men can never hope to achieve, like it was child's play. Hence. Thud. Pumph. Sanji fell off his throne of unconscious bodies and crashed into the ground, curling in on himself with his hands clenched tightly against his poor ears. Usopp didn't even remain conscious and fell backwards towards Zoro with pure white eyes. Even Nami, without having her senses enhanced through Luffy's gift, had her ears ringing in pain. What do you mean, fiancé? That's not possible. How'd you manage to get someone like him? As many other villagers threw in their 2 cents on the matter, the lead rioter called for order. Enough, all of you. The voices of the villagers dropped to low hushes amongst themselves, eyeing the outsiders, sizing them up, or appreciating the eye candy. Whatever her reasoning. Nami's found a life away from this hellhole. She can finally be free. The pirate crew, that wasn't curled up on the ground in pain or unconscious, was befuddled by the riot leader's words. Nami had told them all of how she was viewed as a traitor of the village. They had no idea of her true reasoning for joining Arlong. Believing she had joined forces with her mother's killer for the chance of a life filled with wealth, consequences be damned. The riot leader smiled wryly, fully expecting the confusion. We know about your deal with Arlong, Nami. Najiko told us right after you left for your first treasure hunt. Genzo asked us to continue on with treating you like an outsider. Said it helped you somehow because of how things were right before the end. Another villager added with shame-filled eyes. The navigator stiffened. They knew. They weren't supposed to know. This was something she was supposed to live with. As one of the many self-induced punishments for how her last few memories of Belmere were bitterly made, she didn't deserve the village's sympathy. She was. We stood by back then, the riot leader said bitterly, furious with himself. Respecting Nami's wishes was an excuse they had told themselves time and time again. It was part of the reason they honored Genzo's request. But mostly it was cowardice. No more. The riot leader stepped forward and grabbed Nami by the shoulders as he stared down at her. You found someone to love. That's good. Get as far away from here as you can. We live or we die, it doesn't matter. It ends today. The navigator was still reeling from the revelation that the village knew of her true reasons for joining forces with Arlong, so she could only gape as the riot leader turned to Luffy with a stone-cold glare. The wolfman's face was a blank sheet in response. Take care of her. The riot leader turned away from Luffy, not expecting an answer. Today. We end this. The villagers all threw up their machetes, pitchforks, gardening tools, and whatever else they could muster up for weaponry as they roared in approval. Leave Nami. And be free. Sanji, Usopp and Zoro all collectively shared a glance and braced themselves. Why? Because while Luffy's face was a blank sheet, his eyes glowed with barely restrained power. You're all bloody fools. The wolfman said coldly with a haughty smile, getting the riot leader's attention as well as the attention of every other villager present. This isn't some drama where you the oppressed suddenly win or Nami gets her freedom with your sacrifice. This is nothing but a folly. The riot leader turned on the wolfman with a face filled with rage. So, it's the best shot we got. What do you know, brat? Do you have any better ideas? This was the kind of man Nami wanted to marry? An arrogant, condescending prick with a pretty face and decent body? Any more degrading thoughts that might have come to mind to the riot leader or any of the villagers came to a screeching halt as they were all pushed down to their knees by a wave of force the likes of which they had never experienced before. Fear for the fishmen? long forgotten as the man before them suddenly seemed more like a savage, untouchable beast than the fishmen ever were. Arlong ain't nothing but a guppy compared to this, the riot leader thought incredulously as the pressure vanished and the mysterious man laughed heartily. As a matter of fact I do. Sit back and enjoy the show. Nami's fiancé said with a wide 1,000-watt smile as he took off his straw hat and placed it upon the navigator's head. I ask my queen to do the same. Nami turned to Luffy with questioning eyes. From afar you'll be able to catch every. Luffy cupped his navigator's chin up. Single. Nami shivered slightly from their ever-shortening proximity, her captain's musky scent draping over her. Moment. Overwhelming her as he captured her lips. Luffy stood before the gate with a half-lidded gaze and a cocky smirk, his black captain's coat with gold trimming flowing with the winds, his new cutlass at the ready, by his side. On his right stood Zoro, arms crossed and bored as his arm rested over Wado Ichimonji, on his left was Sanji, enjoying a fresh cigarette, and directly behind Luffy stood Usopp, adjusting and checking over his equipment one last time. A few feet away stood the villagers who murmured amongst themselves, Nami at the forefront, watching her crew intensely. All eyes on me, ready or not. Luffy called out, focusing his audience's attention on him as he walked to the gate and knocked on it. Listening for when the talking inside came to an abrupt end before switching from knocking on the door to flicking it right off its hinges. Straight for where he could hear the distinct, ha 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 ha, his beloved loathed oh so much, I'm making waves. Boom. Arlong. Boss. Captain. A cacophony of shocked cries filled the air as the Arlong pirate's captain was no longer on his throne. Or what was left of it anyway. A cloud of smoke and rubble in a large gaping hole on the wall opposite of the gate revealed where the sawtooth fishman had been sent flying away. A ray fishman with pigtails clenched his fists and grit his teeth as he turned towards the source of the attack. A human with a half-lidded condescending gaze and equally arrogant smirk looking down on them. You can't escape. Luffy said in a sing-song voice as the ray fishman roared with an unquenchable thirst for blood. I'm on my way. As the other fishman pirates rallied behind the ray fishman, Karubi they called him, Luffy flashed past them. You can't stop. Hands crossed, dripping with blood. Fishman blood. What I got. All but 3 fishmen suddenly sprayed the air crimson as they fell. The ray fishman Karubi, a bulky blonde blue-skinned fishman fitting the description Nami gave of an Arlong pirate officer named Shu, and the one fishman ordained to leave relatively unscathed. Luffy flashed the remaining fishmen and his audience a dazzling smile as he dramatically thrust his hands outwards to his side. Ready or not. Nayu, the octopus fishman, Hachi, backed away from the wolfman nervously, the silhouette of an older human with long white hair and deep abyssal eyes flashing in his mind. It has been years since he'd seen the old man, but he'd never forget the power he exuded. A power the wolfman seemed to have no trouble competing against. Karubi, I don't think. Cocky human scum. I'll teach you what it means to anger a level 40 black belt of fishman karate. Karubi ran towards Luffy, or attempted to anyway. It was difficult to run over to someone when a blonde cook jumps in between and swiftly axe kicks you. Surprisingly to Sanji, Karubi had only staggered momentarily. The fact the ray fishman had not been immediately introduced to the pavement was impressive enough that he whistled as he bumped up Karubi's rank in terms of threat level. Looks like you might actually be able to make me break a sweat. The martial artist was not amused. Fist of 100 bricks. Karubi delivered a punch capable of achieving just as its name implied, but the devastating force of his technique was cut short as he was sent flying by the cook's nimbler roundhouse kick. Straight into the wall, embedding himself in it. Shu and Hachi gaped in disbelief. Not only was the invader's captain a monster, the crew members were as well. The villagers were in similar states of disbelief but trembled euphorically. The sight of their decade-long captors being thrown around like nothing but fodder was cathartic. The villagers began cheering for the human pirates, jeering at the last 3 fishmen standing. Geez. How much force did you put in that flick, Luffy? Sanji glared bitterly at Karubi, who groaned as he broke free. It takes a lot just to manage to send him flying with a kick. The wolfman shrugged as he took a seat on the remnants of Arlong's throne, casually licking the blood of his latest victims of his fingers. Finish these guys off faster, then I can go back to bringing you up to this level. Guess that's our cue to wrap things up, Usopp. Zoro said, unsheathing his only remaining blade since the duel he had with Mihawk. Takoyaki's mine. You deal with Smooch. The swordsman tilted his head to the inside of Arlong Park, before walking inside. Hachi followed close behind, sweating bullets but resigned to giving his all in the eventual clash. I hear you're something of a sniper yourself. Shall we take this elsewhere? Usopp offered, gesturing to the gate leading to the beach. Sanji's not going to be as considerate for much longer. The marksman tried to deliver his words with confidence, and while his words would certainly exude such an effect, the fact he was shivering like a pup out of the bath ruined any chance of that. It was so pathetic Shu wasn't sure he even wanted to fight the guy. At least until he looked around and was reminded of his comrades. After that, Shu growled at Usopp, who gulped as the blue fishman joined him in going towards the beach. You're strong for a human, I will admit. Karubi grudgingly conceded on that point as he adopted a fighting position. But that strength is only from your speed. Now that I know that, your chances of victory are. Wait. How are we gonna see what happens now? A random villager shouted, conflicted. If we all stay here, we won't see the other bastards get their beat down. While initially getting weird looks from his fellow villagers and Nami, his conundrum spread like wildfire. Well, except when it came to Hachi. None of them particularly hated Hachi, so they weren't invested in seeing him get beat up. We split. Whoever wants to see Karubi get wrecked stays. Those who want that narcissistic blonde put in his place goes to the beach. We will share the battles tonight. A chorus of approval rang across the village as Nami stared incredulously at a section of the villagers left and began running towards the beach. Karubi was in a similar gobsmacked state as Nami, only to turn crimson red. Those cowardly scum. I'll tear them to shreds. The level 40 black belt turned back to Sanji. After I mop the floor with. Sanji didn't wait for the fishman to finish his monologue and just walked towards him with a cheery smile on his face. Like he was a kid on his way to school. The calm serene expression on the blonde's face threw Karubi for a loop. The fishman just stood there, unsure what to make of Sanji's strange behavior. Luffy, on the other hand, smiled as his half-lidded gaze seemed to become sinister despite not moving once. Nami focused intently on what was about to happen. Luffy had told her what Sanji did back on Baratie. It wasn't shave or any martial art that could be taught. It was something Sanji was born with a natural affinity towards. Pumph. The blonde cook eventually collided with the Ray fishman and both just stood there for a second. 1 second. Karubi's training in martial arts and experience in battle was the only thing that kept him from instantly perishing as he backed away from a kick Sanji sent his way. A kick that would have instantly snapped his neck. Unbalanced from leaning away from the initial kick, Kurobi had no choice but to cross his arms for the following attack. Crunch. Crack. Tremor. Karubi gasped out in pain as the bones in his arm felt like they'd been hammered with a full fucking ship. The Ray fishman's backside wasn't any better as the force of the stomp had knocked him off his feet and straight into the ground. Cracks spread from the crater caused by the impact. The earth trembled from the sheer amount of power Sanji had put into what should have finished the job. TCH. For a side dish, you're being a hell of a tenacious bitch. Sanji liked to have his ingredients fresh. He did not like his ingredients being irritating cunts. Jumping from his spot above Karubi's crossed arms, Sanji spun in the air, crashing back down with the intent of spilling the side dish's brains out on the pavement. Karubi had been able to dodge at the last second, however, causing the spot where his head had been to erupt upwards as Sanji's foot slammed into the pavement. Taking advantage of Sanji's less than desirable state of balance, the Ray fishman tackled the cook into the ocean. The two disappear underneath the water's surface. The two combatants' audience gasped in horror. On the land humans had a chance, but in the water? No, that was the fishman's playground. Nami. I'm so? The riot leader approached the Orangeette intending to try consoling her for her comrade's unfortunate demise. He wasn't able to finish as the waters began behaving wildly. A clear indication of a raging battle underneath the water's surface. It's not possible. Darling. You have no idea what's possible. Nami smirked down at the riot leader who flinched back. The little orange spitfire everyone loved was there, yes. But her eyes. They were twisted, sadistic, vengeful. Deep down the riot leader blamed himself for the darkness that now thrived inside her. Luffy laughed with hellish glee as his eyes gleamed gold insanity. His darkness matched that of his beloved. These fishmen believed themselves special, favored, believed themselves so far above, they were beyond our reach, beyond our limits. From afar, rubble stirred as the monster rose back up, hidden from sight by dust. But the wolfman knew he was there. He knew the predator was listening. They are wrong. They call themselves the chosen race. To me, they're not even stepping stones. They're delicacies, they're prey. In all my years as the conqueror of these islands, every kill, every death I caused was never personal. The villagers backed away fearfully as the beast who'd been taken out of the fight made his inevitable return. The Sharkman, a living embodiment of inextinguishable rage, hidden beneath a mask of annoyance. But killing you. Arlong's eyes resembled that of bloodthirsty Sea King as he stood in front of the hole he'd been launched through. I'm going to enjoy it. So very, very much. Arlong smiled arrogantly as the raging waves calmed. The water returned to playing its rhythmic song of waves crashing against the shore and the smell of blood permeated in the air. Your hubris was your downfall, boy. Your crew is dead, but worry not. You'll join them soon. Luffy couldn't help himself. He erupted in belly-aching laughter much to the fishman's confusion and irritation. This wasn't the laugh of someone who'd succumbed to insanity. To the deaths of their comrades. The wolfman's delight put him on edge. And soon, the fishman realized why. She. Well, Arlong, Zoro stood above his opponent, bloody, bruised, but victorious. The battle was not a one-sided one. The damage he sustained from Mihawk weighed him down, and the octopus fishman was quite possibly the strongest swordsman he'd ever faced who didn't hail from the New World. Both combatants were left panting, Hachi's blood staining the ground. The fishman was in far worse shape than Zoro, but he would live. What are you waiting for? Hachi asked, pausing as he coughed out blood, eyes clenched in pain before opening to glare tiredly at the human swordsman. To the victor goes his defeated foe's life. Take mine and be done with it. Originally, ZPRP wasn't even going to actually battle the octopus fishman. He was supposed to share the news and wait with Hachi until Usopp returned from his battle. But the octopus fishman's resolve to fight resonated with the swordsman, and so Zoro drew his precious blade, and stood at the ready, his opponent doing the same. You knew you would die, yet stood up and fought anyway. That was the only reason I fought you. To honor that warrior's spirit, Zoro replied, taking a seat next to the octopus fishman whose eyes followed him, waiting for the rest. You didn't stand up to Arlong because he was stronger than you. And he was your brother. He was a monster, even you saw that, but still. He was your family. The best you could do for Nami was trying to get Arlong to show mercy, giving his victims quick painless deaths. Or at least not torture them for days on end. Is that it? Hachi asked, his breathing evening out as the pain dulled with his fading consciousness. Even if I live after this, I have nowhere to go. I'm the only one who Nami likely asked to be spared, so after today, I have no one. No one I can bear to show my face to anyway. Zoro looked down on the octopus fishman whose eyes filled with shame. If only he was stronger, he might have been able to stop Arlong and help the sawtooth shark fishman see the right path. The path their older brother walked, the path to a bright future for all, where equality, peace and prosperity was open for all. Arlong's freedom from impelled down came with a price you know. That older brother of yours warned him to not start things against humans again. Zoro's words caught Hachi's attention and the fishman fought to stay awake longer, to hear this new information to the end. Didn't you think it was weird Arlong seemed chummy with the marine base, round here? If word of his actions reached the new world, that guy would have been on his way years earlier. Hachi's eyes widened to the size of saucers as Zoro dusted off his pants, standing back up once he saw Usopp pass by one of the building's windows. Zoro began walking away from the fishman who, despite his desire not to, was succumbing to the welcoming embrace of unconsciousness. You're a great swordsman, Hachi. Let's duel again sometime. Was Usopp terrified as he and Chu stood against each other like the cowboys of old? Yes. Was he ashamed to admit that fact? No, not anymore. In the past, perhaps he would have considered it cowardice, but Luffy showed him what being brave really meant. Warriors weren't brave because they charged into war, into battle, because they felt no fear. Of course they did. They were brave because despite their fears, they stood up, took their spears and raised them against surrender. Surrender. Giving up without even fighting. That was true cowardice. Did that fact stop the archer from shaking in his boots though? Well, there was a reason Usopp was able to think back to his talk with Luffy. Chu couldn't bring himself to take the archer seriously and just stood there on the waves sweat dropping at the trembling human. Your captain killed my crewmates, but they didn't suffer. Chu said coolly as he took a stance similar to that of sumo wrestlers. For that and for your bravery, as pathetic as it is, I will grant you a swift death. Just stay right there. Gathering as much water as he could, Chu was ready to end this match right out the gate. Usopp had other plans, as he abruptly seemed to become the epitome of calm, moving like a well-oiled machine as he notched a flame star on his slingshot and his aim was true. Chu's vision flashed red as the flame star exploded into a blaze dead center on his face. The fishman's loaded shot lost as he sputtered, smacking the flames away, hitting himself in the process. Bastard, you tricked me? Usopp would later realize that the abrupt change would make it seem as if he'd been faking his fears all along. At the moment, however, he was focused on one thing and one thing only. Complete the mission. The archer continued to assault the fishman with more and more flame stars aiming for his weak points, his face, his joints, and... well, he didn't go for the crotch since that was a tad too cruel even for Chu. The fishman's rage soared and all his cool was lost as he blindly charged forwards to where the shots were coming from. Usopp, who had nothing compromising his vision dodge, rolled to the side and switched to his bow and arrows, lethal arrows, and aimed for Chu's tendons. Chu howled in pain as he fell on his knees to the sandy shores. The tendons are severed by the archer's arrows. Even if he was to survive this fight, the fishman would likely never be able to move again. Chu knew this and decided to even the score if it was the last thing he did. That was his final plan, at least until the sounds of cheering villagers reached the two snipers and a different course of action was decided. 100-shot water gun. Facing the humans, Chu shot high-velocity bullets made of water. The human pirates want to free the people? Fine, they can have whatever remains of them. Chu's eyes shined with malicious light as the annoying pests screamed as a barrage of bullets raced towards them. Bastard. Shave. One benefit of being defeated by Jin was the hellish training additions Luffy added in for him. Nami wasn't entirely spared as Luffy was not one to give preferential treatment when it came to training. Sanji on the other hand was steadfast on not leaving even a scratch on the navigator. So while Nami ended up unconscious by a strange technique Sanji had, Usopp had to run for his life lest his nose end up as a nail for the floor. Again. The promise of a seemingly everlasting beatdown should he get caught enabled the archer to be the first of the crew to achieve shave. Which was how he ended up in this situation. Arms spread wide as he stood before the villagers, his back towards them as the impacts began. The attack wasn't exactly as advertised. There were at most 45 bullets, but they certainly felt like he'd been hit by 100 bullets. The archer coughed up blood and staggered where he stood, his body tilting forward as he looked ready to collapse. The villagers who'd been shocked into silence called out to him, moved to help him as the blonde fishman painfully made his way to the surf. The villagers stopped however when Usopp held an open palm towards them. Breathing heavily he turned to them slightly. This is my fight. Please, just enjoy the show. You're at your limit, kid. Dear God, you're young enough to be my son. An elderly woman cried trying to run towards the archer. Her realization of how young the man actually was made her feel disgusted with herself. Children were standing up to deal with monsters as adults stood by and watched. The rest of the audience shared her thoughts and strived forward yet again. You have your whole life ahead of you. You've wounded him severely. We can finish this, please just. If you interfere, my dream will be tarnished, Usopp said, drawing Luffy's hunting knife from its sheath. His captain had been kind enough to lend it to him in case he needed it for close quarters combat. The archer had a different idea on how to use it though. I dream. To be a brave warrior of the seas. I will not run away from my foes and let others take my place. I will not dump my responsibilities onto other people's shoulders. The archer's eyes were sharp with clarity, his breathing even as he stepped forward, twisting his body as he prepared to end this with his next attack. I will finish the battles I start by myself and no one else. Whether I live or die, may the gods decide the fate of which warrior's life is thrust into legend. Chu had to give it to the coward. He had a gift for speech. Should have focused on that instead of actually fighting. The fishman jeered as he stood back up despite the pain and reeled back on the ocean waves before firing his ultimate technique, water cannon. The archer twisted his body forward with his next step as he threw Luffy's knife straight into the fisherman's destructive technique. The knife met the torrent. Dot and cleaved right through it. The villagers couldn't believe their eyes as the massive bullet of water was obliterated by a mere hunting knife. But what happened next stunned them all into silence. Shing. Boom. Thunk. Almost simultaneously the archer hit the ground on his knees as the hunting knife embedded itself into the sand. Thud. And Chu's headless body fell forward unceremoniously. Bits and pieces of his exploded head either scattered around him or dragged away by the surf. Usopp groaned, his body screaming in protest as he stood back up and walked to his captain's knife. The blood washed away, leaving only the fading remnants of the black sheen the blade had been imbued with. Sanji was not having a good time. The moment he'd been taken beneath the waves, the tables turned. His kicks could still deliver devastating blows, but Karubi's mobility made it damn near impossible to even keep the fishman in his sights. The Ray fishman went to work, zipping through him while delivering every technique he learned in fishman karate. But even then Sanji didn't fall. Even then he glared down on Karubi as if he were nothing more than a toddler who didn't get his way. Eventually Karubi slipped up. He lingered for too long. Collier. Zeph's training was hellish and thorough. The old captain of the Cook Pirates had his fair share of battles in unfavorable environments and made sure Sanji learned to deal with such hindrances as well. Thus, while not as fast or powerful as it would have been on land, the kick to Karubi's neck was still devastating. The fishman's neck threatened to snap under the force, but the power behind the kick wasn't enough, much to Sanji's annoyance. No matter, he still had plenty of his own techniques to tenderize his side dish with. Then Karubi caught Sanji by surprise when a long whip-like appendage wrapped around the cook's waist. No wait, that wasn't an appendage. You had a ponytail? Was the only thing Sanji was able to say before Karubi returned to delivering every technique he hadn't tried yet. Perhaps Sanji wasn't one to judge, but calling out attacks that weren't finishing blows just irked the cook as he took Karubi's every blow with no more than an annoyed glare. Nami had said the martial artist was a sadist who practically got off on seeing and hearing the agony of his victims, so the blonde wasn't about to give him the satisfaction of seeing how much damage he was actually taking. That plan went right out the window when Karubi locked his arms around Sanji and took them to the ocean depths faster than any human should go. The internal damage was too much and Sanji coughed out blood as he howled in pain. His screams of anguish, music to the fisherman's ears. There was another issue as well. See, there's this very basic thing Sanji had forgotten he needed to do, called breathing. Fuck. Need air. The fishman sneered victoriously as they reached the bottom, Sanji seemingly seconds away from entering the death's domain. Humans are so weak, so feeble. Karubi mocked as he spread his arms wide. The underwater reef they found themselves in more ominous than beautiful, with the skeletons littered around. Like what you see. You should, you'll be joining them. Sanji's eyes flared with unbridled rage as his gaze landed on a specific pair of skeletons. A woman, identifiable from the structure and the clothing, what remained anyway, and a child. Likely no more than 5 years old. This sight brought back memories the coon never wanted to remember. Sanji swore to never use his hands in combat to directly attack his foes, but for this, well, some rules were meant to be bent. He hadn't really been considering it seriously before, but now, Ray was on the menu and his fresh ingredient was due for preparation. I mean seriously, you humans really believed you could stand up to us, Fi Ga? Karubi's words were cut short when Sanji abruptly shoved his fingers deep into the Ray fishman's gills. Karubi faced the skies and silently cried out to the heavens as Sanji dug even deeper before mercilessly ripping them out. Too steeped in fury, the cook didn't question how he'd had the strength to pull off such a feat and just thrust his foot into the sand, but deep enough for his next and final attack. Aplatir. Sanji raised his free leg up in an arc before slamming it down on Karubi's forehead and flattening it against the ocean floor. The seabed rumbled as the force of the impact spread, destroying the reef and kicking a sandstorm. For a moment silence, and then, I need. Like a rocket, Sanji burst out the cloud of sand, dragging Karubi's lifeless boy on the way up to that which he seeked, air. Reality is often disappointing. Luffy grinned down on Arlong with a lazy half-lidded gaze oozing with condescension. His crew returned from their respective fights simultaneously, as if every piece had fallen into place perfectly. The thought that they'd all been dancing in the palm of a lesser creature's hands filled Arlong with unchained fury. His predatory senses helped the shark fishman identify who had dealt with who. The scrawny runt with a bow and arrow had a knife that reeked of fishman's blood, and the damage he suffered was reminiscent of the Arlong pirate sniper's techniques. The dark-skinned swordsman with a bandana on his head sported a few slash wounds, and the oil stains were the signature of very specific fishmen subspecies. The opponent of the blonde who'd risen from the water was fairly obvious even without deducing who had fought the other two. Arlong ground his teeth together as his gaze landed on the corpse the blonde human brought with him. Its upper head flattened like a pancake, blood and brain matter still streaming out of his right-hand fishman's ears. Sweet. Magnificent. Crisp. Sanji took a deep breath as he dropped Karubi before screaming at the top of his aching lungs, air. Plop. Usopp and Zoro both shared exasperated looks before sighing and walking over to drag the unconscious cook away before Arlong got any ideas. Nami stood in front of the villagers shaking her head, but the smile hidden beneath her fiancé's hat revealed how ecstatic she was over how smooth everything's been going so far. Not to mention those were the hard parts. Nami let an easy smile grace her face as she looked up to meet her decade-long tormentor's eyes. Arlong was fuming. No fuming didn't even cut it. No words could describe the amount of rage and hate he was experiencing right now. His crew, his sworn brothers, were torn to shreds, never to see the completion of their goal. Their dream, that they strived to build ever since they were nothing more than fries swimming around the dodgy alleys of Fishman Island's Fishman district, the lowest of the lows in that kingdom ruled by a naive queen whose dreams brought her and her family nothing but grief and death. The casual way the two humans moved to pick up their unconscious companion incensed Arlong past the point of logical thinking. It didn't matter how, he was going to bring ruin to every bloody human on this island, no, every human in the world. With a thunderous, deafening roar, Arlong surged forward far faster than any opponent the Straw Hats had ever faced so far. The Straw Hats sniper panicked as the world around him began moving slower as his senses were pushed to their limits. Had Usopp been in better shape, he could have shaved himself and his two crewmates away, but now he would only be able to save himself, and he'd be damned before he left them. Zoro and he were both almost taken down by the roar itself, but the adrenaline from this being a life-and-death situation kept them from fainting this time. Usopp knew Zoro was still recovering from his duel with Mihawk, but even at peak strength, the marksman didn't like the swordsman's chances against this monster who was only a meter away from them when he'd leapt forward. "Sorry, but this is between you." Arlong's face was clutched in Luffy's hands and squeezed hard as the Wolfman stepped forward, preparing. "And me?" The back of Arlong's head was forced deep into the floor, the power behind the attack strong enough it actually sent Usopp, Zoro, Sanji and the fresh ingredient for the side dish flying away. Boom. "Luffy." Usopp screamed right before his face became really good friends with the dirt right next to Nami. "Damn it, man. You're going to end up doing more damage to us than the fish em." Usopp screamed indignantly while Zoro landed on his feet with Karubi over his shoulder. Sanji landed on top of Usopp, ending the archers shrieking. Zoro chuckled before sitting down by Nami's side. The navigator hadn't looked away once. Her eyes trained on the fight between the two huge monsters meters away. Luffy loosened his grip on Arlong's face and stepped back to let the fishman get back up. This wasn't going to be a quick fight. With a deep growl, Arlong rose and immediately went on the offensive. There were no fancy techniques or skilled martial arts in this clash. Just all-out brawling. For every punch Arlong sent his way, Luffy matched it with his own, each collision creating dispersing winds. It started slowly at first, but the speed of the blows quickly became too fast for the audience to even see. The punches each fighter threw became blurred images as the winds picked up and began affecting the surrounding area. The trees swayed and the waves shifted as the two fighters just kept getting faster and faster. Nami had to keep a hand over her beloved's hat to keep it from flying away as the gusts of tempest winds whirled past. Luffy's eyes narrowed and his smirk twitched as he sidestepped the latest jab to enter Arlong's indefensible area. The sharkman's breath was taken away as Luffy delivered an uppercut angled just right that his fist dug behind Arlong's sternum. Lifting the fishman off his feet, Luffy twisted as he slammed Arlong down into the floor head first, kicking his latest punching bag towards one of the building's pillars right after. "Is that the best you can do? Is that the overwhelming distance you say puts you higher than humans?" Luffy mocked Arlong, looking down on the pest all the while. Arlong rumbled a deep guttural growl as he stood back up from the fallen pillar. "You're no human, boy." Arlong grinned as he looked past Luffy and at the villagers who cowered under his gaze, Nami and the other Straw Hats just glaring back. "You ate a devil fruit. You had to give up so much just to be able to have a chance of surpassing us fishmen, the chosen race." Luffy raised an eyebrow at that. The fishman wasn't wrong. He wasn't exactly human anymore, and in this entire fight he'd been in his bathed in blood form, wolf ears and tail out and about. While Luffy mused about such things, Arlong engaged him once more. Luffy ducked under the clawed swing Arlong threw his way and responded in kind, slashing Arlong's torso with his own wolf claws. Arlong winced but continued smiling nonetheless as he threw out more haphazard attacks. Each and every one of the sharkman's attacks evaded and then responded in kind by the wolfman. "You see, this is power that only those who abandon humanity can achieve." Arlong declared victoriously as despite losing the battle he wasn't wrong. To the villagers of the Konami Islands it was hard on their psyche. Years of being under his rule and ideologies had broken their belief in themselves as humans. Now they were being freed, and for that they would be forever grateful. But the truth would remain edged deep in their minds. Humans were nothing more than the fishman's playthings. Without the power of devil fruits, powerful devil fruits, humans are inferior in every way. Aside from spreading like rats, I suppose. Shahahaha. Luffy lost his smile as the depressing mood descended among the villagers and he reached up to grasp Arlong's face before throwing him across the ground towards the ocean. "You think humanity can't reach the level of the fishman without ceasing to be human? Without consuming powerful devil fruits?" Luffy shrunk back to his normal height, his wolf ears and tail receding as well, glaring at Arlong who glanced towards the waters. "Let's test that." While the villagers began to feel anxiety over the deactivation of the wolfman's devil fruit, the Straw Hats just looked on without much care. Well, most of them anyway. Sanji was mumbling in his sleep about finding the all blue and occasionally throwing names around as well. Nami shifted her focus towards him for a second as one name kept repeating over and over again. The name was held with such love that she began to wonder who the woman actually was. "Be careful what you wish for, boy." Arlong sneered before diving into water, his dorsal fin circling around being the only indication that he hadn't turned and run. Shark on darts. Like a torpedo, Arlong shot straight out the water towards Luffy, his sharp, indestructible nose aimed for the wolfman's heart. Luffy turned away and breathed deeply, keeping his face turned to the side so Arlong was still in his vision. The villagers cried out in horror, not knowing what was about to happen. Zoro glanced at Usopp. Dot and chuckled. The marksman glared at him, knowing what went through Zoro's mind and, without realizing it, rubbed his forehead as he remembered when Luffy used the technique on him. Tekai. Luffy's muscles tensed at the exact moment of impact between himself and Arlong. Unbreakable. Instead of Arlong's indestructible nose piercing right through Luffy, the torpedo of the fishman was sent flying off through more of the building's pillars. It was like when a kid threw a ball against a pole and the projectile bounced off to another direction. The villagers were stunned into silence once more before erupting into cheers. Zoro pressed his headphones tighter against his ears, Usopp doing the same for himself and Sanji. That isn't something humans can accomplish. Arlong growled as he stood up from the rubble. Luffy scoffed before responding. You clearly never fought the upper ranks of the Marines then. Strength like that is compulsory if you want to make it there. The wolfman gave Arlong a deadpan look as the fishman popped his teeth out. Inwardly Luffy thought it was cool and wanted to keep a set, but outwardly he remained his annoyed, unimpressed expression. Power like this can be achieved by anyone. It's only a matter of how much discipline they have and how much time they're willing to sacrifice so they can achieve it. Arlong held a set of his teeth on each hand like mittens. Gross, shiny, very likely smelly mittens. Chomping tooth. Paper art. Luffy leaned away, sidestepped, ducked, and even backflipped over Arlong as the fishman tried again and again to get a chunk out of the human captain. Stay still, you cheeky rat. How about? No, Luffy smiled cheekily as he ducked under the latest attack. Arlong growled and pulled his hand back ready to strike again only to not see Luffy. Then he noticed the clapping and rapid shuffles of feet hitting the ground. Arlong looked down to see Luffy doing some weird dance while making funny faces at him. The villagers were hunched over laughing their butts off. Usopp joined them. Zoro and Namo shook their heads over Luffy's antics and Arlong looked even more bloodthirsty than before. How dare you mock me, you insignificant piece of... Luffy rolled his eyes and rolled backwards right before Arlong clamped his jaws around his head. Before Arlong could attack again, Luffy somersaulted over him and front kicked him right on the bum, sending Arlong face first into the floor, his nose digging into it. Alright, enough fun. Luffy lost his wide smirk and started hopping lightly on his feet as he kept one arm close to his chest and the other swaying to and fro. Arlong stood back up and looked absolutely murderous over the mockery Luffy was making out of him. Shark on tooth. Arlong roared out as he prepared to launch himself towards Luffy again. That was the plan anyway, but the flurry of what looked like a single punch but felt like dozens to the face dazed the fishman whose eye sockets were beginning to darken. What the hell? Luffy wasn't giving Arlong a chance to recover this time. The wolfman kept hopping from one side to another delivering a flurry of what had to be 36 punches so quickly they only appeared as a single punch in targeted areas of Arlong's body, vital points. It didn't take long for Arlong to look like a Dalmatian with all the bruises Luffy was giving him. Arlong roared in frustration, opening his maw as wide as he could, getting ready to take another shot at chomping down on Luffy. In his mind, Luffy sighed disappointedly. This bastard was the infamous Knight of the Sea's sworn brother? Luffy surged forward and delivered a vicious uppercut that buried his fist deep into Arlong's stomach. He didn't break through skin, but he did heavily damage the fishman's internal organs. Arlong's eyes bugged out as he coughed up blood, his feet leaving the ground briefly. Before Arlong could regain his bearings, Luffy began delivering jabs and hooks left and right, twisting his body back and planting his feet firmly on the ground for the final blow. At least it would be if Arlong knew what was good for him. The next punch sent rippling waves of energy through Arlong's whole body before the fishman was sent right into Arlong Park's building. The sound of crunching bones reached even the villagers' ears when Luffy's fist came into contact with the fishman's body. Is it over? The riot leader asked after moments of silence. There was no shifting of the rubble. No signs of Arlong getting back up. The villagers couldn't help themselves. They jumped in joy and hugged each other with streaming tears. The nightmare was finally over. Or so they thought. A hulking figure burst through the building's roof. It was Arlong, and he brought a friend. Arlong cried out for war as he swung down his massive serrated sword, Kiribachi, straight for Luffy's head. While the villagers screamed in fear and disbelief, Luffy didn't even flinch. He'd been able to hear the scraping of metal from the rubble and, thanks to Nami, had a pretty good guess on what Arlong was bringing into the fight. With a bored look on his face, Luffy drew his blade and swung it up to meet Kiribachi. The sound of clashing steel was followed by the cracking earth as the strength behind Arlong's swing pushed against Luffy. The wolfman stood still, unbroken, but the floor could not handle the force. Once his feet touched the ground, Arlong began hacking and slashing at Luffy like there was no tomorrow. Fishmen were superior in every way, and one of the most glaring differences between them and humans was strength. Fishmen were leaps and bounds ahead of humans in terms of strength with no way to close the gap between them. This was a simple fact, a universal truth that Arlong preached for all his life. Now as he stood before Luffy, he began questioning those beliefs. With every swing that was parried, blocked, or pushed back with effortless ease, the reality that all he believed in, all he preached about set in. It was nothing but complete and utter bullshit. Even without using the activatable powers of the fruit, he still isn't human. Yes, he abandoned it regardless. Arlong thought, desperately trying to deny reality. Unfortunately, reality is very rarely denied. All it took was a look behind the human captain. While the captain ate a devil fruit, did his crew do so as well? No, his instincts told him that only Luffy had eaten a devil fruit. The danger signals that flared up as he was slowly beginning to lose his rage and calm was both mighty impressive and downright terrifying. Compared to their captain, the crew were only pebbles in the presence of a mountain. Yet those pebbles stood up to his crew, his brothers, Dot and Wan. Like I said in the beginning, Arlong, reality is often disappointing. Luffy said coldly. There was no pity, no mercy in the wolfman's eyes for the fishman whose beliefs, whose world was crumbling. The next swing was Kiribachi's last. Luffy's blade, coated in a black sheen, shattered the blade right down to the hilt in an upward swing. The next attack sliced Arlong's torso open, spurting blood into the air and staining Luffy's face. The wolfman didn't care, he kept his cold, frosty eyes trained on Arlong even as crimson droplets crashed against them. The fishman fell to his knees, blood leaking out his sliced front as he coughed out more from his maw. He already looked horrible outwardly, but inside, that was where the true damage was. Still, even broken physically with crumbled beliefs, Arlong's maliciousness won out as he glared hatefully at Luffy. Have your revenge, human scum. Arlong hacked up more blood before a vicious sneer overtook his features as he shifted his gaze over to his little kitten. The damage has already been done. That girl you've taken a liking to won't ever be free of me. Shahaha shahaha. At this point Sanji had come to and was barely being held back by Usopp as the cook wanted nothing more than to crush that arrogant son of a bitch's skull like he had Karubi's. Zoro silently kept Nami in the corner of his eyes, watching, gauging her reaction as the villagers behind them looked ready to run over and trample the fishman themselves. The navigator herself just looked on, her eyes hidden by the brim of her beloved's treasure. You won't be there forever, you know, and when she's alone in the dark she'll remember. She'll think back to her time as my crewmate. She'll go to sleep and fear to open her eyes and find this was nothing more than a hopeful, naive dream. She will never be free. I will haunt her even in death, for she is M.I. Arlong's vision went white in a flash as his head was knocked to the side. His skull definitely cracked and the aftermath made him more nauseous than he'd ever been before. The sharkman's ears were ringing and he didn't even register the fact he'd begun crying out in pain as he was dragged by his hair towards the kitten he'd been playing with for a decade. One sawtooth Arlong as promised, my lady. Luffy bowed his head and brought an arm across his chest as he nonchalantly raised Arlong up to Nami's eye level for her to inspect. The feeling that ran through the villagers was indescribable. Their decade-long tormentor now crying out before them like the village bully after meeting and getting whooped by a real man. Now I believe I can claim my prize. Arlong squirmed in Luffy's grasp and squinted an eye at Nami. The navigator met his eyes with a blank expression. Have your vengeance, Nami. You will never be free. Shaha URK. Arlong's last sliver of a victory was lost, as for the first time in his life, he feared that kitten he'd taken in long ago. The cheerful, vibrant smile she sent his way alone would have raised concern, but her eyes. It seemed like he too would never sleep soundly again, even in death. Sorry dear. I have other plans for you. Nami purred as she traced a finger along the fishman's jawline, keeping her new toy's gaze firmly locked into her own. Kokoyashi Village, 3. Fate comes a-calling on the dark cloudy day. Arlong felt the shudder running down his spine as Nami's dreadful gaze pierced into him. The cheerful smile on the woman's face was the most disconcerting aspect of it all. Whatever plans she had for him, well, Arlong was many things, but a coward wasn't one of them. The fishman's rumbling growl caused the villagers around them to tense, but Nami only frowned. Annoyed, but not because of Arlong. The rest of the Straw Hats bore similar expressions of distaste as the sound of slow clapping reached everyone's ears. Chi. Wonderful. A dark-haired man with whiskers in a Marine captain uniform exclaimed. A squadron of Marine soldiers behind him carrying condescending, sleazy, shit-eating grins mirroring their captains. As according to plan the Arlong pirates have been subdued. Dot and the thief snuffed out. With a dramatic flourish the captain pointed theatrically at Nami, who only stared back unamused, and ordered, men, take the girl along with her fellow criminal buddies. The villagers were quick to voice their opposition. All of them moved to stand in between the Straw Hats and the Marines. You're not taking them anywhere, you cowardly bastard. How corrupt can you scum get? These kiddos ain't nothing but heroes y'all here, and y'all have to get through us to get them. Nezumi merely brushed them off. What were the villagers going to accomplish with their pitchforks, shovels and other garden utensils? They were Marines. These backcountry rabble were nothing. I can see it now, boys. My glorious promotion, hailed as the one to end the tyranny of Arlong, blah blah blah. Nami tuned out everything else, the rat, Captain Nezumi, spouting on and on about as his squadron of Marines laughed and cheered along. Her focus shifted to the immense power that was slowly making its way over towards them. The navigator was starting to sweat a bit. This was the person she'd have to start seeing as her family? There were pros and cons to it. The first pro was about to unfold right before her eyes as the villagers collectively gaped at the arrival of a living legend. The legend was currently gritting his teeth, a large tick mark on his temple as the veins of his neck bulged angrily. The towering man stood behind Nezumi with crossed arms, tapping his foot on the ground as he waited for the corrupt little shit to realize who'd come to say hi. The Marine captain did not notice the legend at all. At least until sunlight broke through the clouds and they were cast underneath a shadow. A really big shadow. Thinking it was a fishman, Nezumi panicked and drew his revolver, shooting without looking. Instead of a deafening bang, however, the sound of bending metal followed by a dull thunk came after he pulled the trigger. His revolver's barrel had been bent upwards. That was impossible, Nezumi thought before he finally gazed upon the fishman. And that was when he knew. Anything else you want to say, brat? He fucked up. VV Vice Admiral G. Garp? Those were Nezumi's only words before the old Vice Admiral proceeded to beat the living hell out of every single Marine there. In the end, Nezumi and his squadron were squished together and bounced up and down like a basketball. How the Vice Admiral managed that without killing them, the villagers did not know. Oh, mercy. Please forgive us, Vice Admiral, sir. It hurts. Stop it, I beg you. The villagers weren't sure they really even wanted to know. While the treatment the corrupt Marines were experiencing was nauseating to see, there was no sympathy in the villagers' eyes for any of them. Instead, they turned their eyes to Garp, believing he might arrest the heroes of the village because even if they helped and saved them, they were still pirates. Garp's reputation was well known throughout the world. A pirate was a pirate. No one would escape him if he had anything to say about it. Garp ignored them all and focused his gaze on Nami. The Vice Admiral seemed like he was looking at an old friend. The action caused much confusion amongst the villagers and even the Straw Hats. What really caught their attention was when Garp openly shuddered under Nami's questioning gaze. Turning to Luffy with a rather bitter expression, Garp said, "You sure know how to pick 'em, don't you, Luffy? It's graduation day all over again." The villagers and corrupt Marines turned from Garp to the Wolfman with confused expressions. Did these two know each other? Garp rubbed his chin while looking up thoughtfully before a wry smirk settled on his face. Hey, they do say history has a way of repeating itself. Garp mused as he continued dribbling Nezumi and the scum squadron. The hell you on about, Gramps? Luffy asked, genuinely lost on what Garp was saying. Most of the other Straw Hats were lost as well, and since their captain hadn't a clue what the old man was talking about, it probably wasn't something they needed to know. Nami had an idea though. So I remind Garp of her, huh? Vice Admiral, we respect you a hell of a lot, sir, but you aren't taking these pirates away, one of the villagers stated resolutely. Luffy just gave him a deadpan look from behind. That's right. You're a legend even round here, sir, but these young'uns are the heroes of the village. Zoro and Sanji shared looks of, just freaking done, and rolled their eyes. You may be his Gramps, but that doesn't mean he ain't a hero, a man cried out, the village cheering along. Nami and Usopp both facepalmed as silence descended upon them. Quicker than lightning, Luffy, Sanji and Zoro put on their noise-canceling headphones and braced for impact. Gramps. The whole village screeched, turning to the Wolfman who pressed the headphones muffs tightly against his head. The rest of his crew had followed suit, even Nami had despite not having the blessing yet. Of course there was someone who was a bit too exasperated to think straight and now suffered the consequences. Garp blinked before bursting out in a hearty laugh, slapping his knee in glee as Usopp, who'd been knocked out from the village's collective screech, foamed at the mouth with pure white eyes facing the sky. Some of the villagers, those that went to witness Chu's last fight, rushed over to get the archer some help. The rest began bombarding Luffy with questions so rapidly the Wolfman's eyes began swirling as he tried to make heads or tails of the mixing voices. Only one individual there was cursing his luck. Of all the people to come after him, it had to be a grandson of the legendary Vice Admiral, whose name was well known even in the depths. Nami noticed the frustrated look in her former tormentor's eyes and smiled cheerfully as she patted him on the shoulder. This, Arlong? Nami's twisted gaze returned to sending shivers down the tyrant's spine, is just the beginning. Behind the sadistic navigator, Garp shivered uncontrollably as the memories of a similarly vicious, vindictive raven-haired woman came back to haunt him. Why did history enjoy repeating itself? The world turned upside down. Pigs had to have started flying around in every farm around the globe. Literal cats and dogs must have come raining down somewhere on this planet. If none of those things happened, then what Genzo was seeing right now just made nada, not even a smidgen of goddamn sense. As the old sheriff seemed to be wondering if he'd gone into a coma, Arlong just stared back with a somewhat amused glint in his eyes. This outcome, much to the fishman's dismay, was so unrealistic to old Genzo that Arlong couldn't help being amused as the sheriff kept scratching his eyes and blinking rapidly just to see if he was dreaming. The fishman couldn't hold in his laughter when Genzo asked the green-haired swordsman to hit him so the sheriff would know definitively that he wasn't just having a good dream. Now Genzo asking wasn't the funny part. The funny part was when Zoro actually did slam the butt of his sword down onto Genzo's head, causing the old man to crumple in a daze. Arlong's amusement came to an end when Zoro came over and slammed the butt of his blade onto the fishman as well. Arlong wasn't dazed, but that didn't mean the action hadn't hurt. Zoro smirked cheekily as he helped Genzo back up, and the riot leader from earlier, Steve, began sharing the tale of Arlong's fall. Usopp had been an instant hit with the village, you see. Now when it came to morale, that was great news. Unfortunately, it also meant there were a lot more exaggerated versions of the battle. Oh, and nobody ever seemed to shut up except for those who joined Zoro in a drinking competition. So far the swordsman was 7-0, all who challenged him so far passed out with swirling eyes. Even if the proof sat before his very eyes, bound and gagged against a boulder, Genzo still couldn't wrap his head around it. A young pirate captain who wasn't even out of his teen years had come in, wrecked Arlong Park, decimated the Fishman pirates, and came out without any notable injuries. Inconceivable. Absolutely inconceivable. The revelation that he was the legendary Garp the Fist's grandson alleviated the disbelief slightly. But the way the young man was acting now took away any concept of being an immovable, towering fortress of power. Genzo's sweat dropped as Luffy performed yet another silly dance with wavy arms and chopsticks in between his nostrils and lips. The villagers were cheering on the wolfman who'd only begun doing such antics once Nami had left the vicinity. Luffy loves Nami, he really does, but acting like a buffoon in front of her was a death wish. Unfortunately, being a charming, entertaining hooligan was in his blood. Evidenced by Garp performing similarly stupid acts as he posed over and over again, flexing his guns in exaggerated positions. Why am I able to read the intended mood, and why is it saying ominous? One of the bulkier villagers stood up and walked towards Garp, clearly intending on joining in on the fun. The old vice admiral took it in stride and grinned as he struck yet another pose. Ho ho? You're approaching me? Can't flex my own guns without getting closer, old geezer. Goo-ha-ha-ha. Very well then. Show me what you got, ya cheeky brat. Genzo blinked uncomprehendingly at the strange vice admiral and pirate captain before he caught sight of a familiar duo. Deciding that they'd have more things to share about the mysterious Luffy, Genzo walked over to them. Johnny. Yosaku. Oh, Genzo, haha, you're up and am already, old man? Genzo smiled good-naturedly as he took a swig of his beer before nodding to the captain. Luffy had gone from the silly dance to performing some strange tune. Didn't sound anything like Genzo had heard of before, but it sure built hype. Mind telling me more about that man right there? Luffy was his name, I believe. Johnny and Yosaku were quick to agree, both very red in the face, drunk out of their skulls. What you want to know first? This was how Genzo was introduced to the insanity that is Monkey D. Luffy. A man who was descended from Garp the Fist himself, capable of decimating the likes of Don Krieg and Arlong as if they were nothing more than children, and could stand toe-to-toe with the greatest swordsman in the world, Dracul Mahawk. Those were all points and revelations in Luffy's favor and thus Genzo's praises. The next tidbit froze the old sheriff's blood cold. And the way he rocks Big Sis Nami's world? Oh man, the guy's a freaking legend. You said it, Yosaku. I mean, those late-night screams may be annoying, but damn must he be a god or something to pull that off with Big Sis of all people. Ha 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 ha. I know, right? Ha 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 go. Once the words actually registered in his head, Sanji was quick to come over and slam both Johnny and Yosaku's faces into the dirt. The two morons were so drunk they were dragging Nami's good name through the dirt with ludicrous bodily nonsense. The cook wasn't having any of that, and after dealing with the two numbskulls it was off to damage control. Turning to the sheriff, Sanji sighed tiredly before speaking. Mr. Genzo, I assure you that Mr. Genzo? Oh no, it was too late. Luffy, run. The wolfman didn't stop his performance when he heard his name being called out. He and his audience just turned towards Sanji with confused questioning looks. When Genzo yelled at the top of his lungs screaming bloody murder though, that's when Luffy's strumming stopped. You dare defile my precious daughter? I'll skin you alive, you brute. Luffy blinked once, stupefied, before quirking a brow with a smirk, having figured out what happened. The drunk numbskulls with heads embedded in the earth spoke volumes. Luffy had no doubts that this would be a quick fix. Just a little explaining and he'll be in Genzo's good graces once more. He did what? Oh fuck. Luffy cursed his luck as Garp looked like someone had just stolen his fresh Makino's double-down chicken sandwich right before his eyes. Luffy knew because he was the thief. He also knew that he was now completely and utterly, well, fucked. Get over here, you cheeky little brat. Alright, Zoro, it's time for the ultimate technique my brothers and I learned growing up. The swordsman looked up from his drink with intrigue. A technique that could save Luffy from Garp the Fist. No such. Wait a minute, this sounded familiar. She. Nigerandayo. Zoro smacked himself with his palm as his captain straight up booked it right when Garp's fist came crashing down where he stood. The dust cloud that erupted outwards caused many a coughing fit. The green-haired man just shook his head as his captain regressed back into yet another episode of childish stupidity. Thankfully it was only short episodes, typically during parties, that this version of his captain surfaced. If it was like this 24/7, Zoro might have killed Luffy already. Or threatened the wolfman that he'd do so anyway. On a cliff edge overlooking the sea, Nami and Najiko stood before their dear mother's pea grave. Nami had brought a few bottles of beer, Belmare's favorite brand. The two sisters quietly took swigs of their beers after opening one for their mother. What happens now? Najiko asked, solemnly staring down at the drink in her hand. She had heard about what happened, and while it was at the end of the day's salvation, she wasn't sure how she felt about the cost. Having kept her gaze firmly locked on the grave, Nami hadn't noticed the distress plastered over her sister's face. I will go on to achieve my dream. Making a map of the world. Nami smirked before she continued. Alongside my fiancé and his crew, his brothers, my family. They're pirates, Nami. Najiko's muttering was soft, but on the silent cliff's edge it was clear as day to the young navigator's ears. You hate pirates. They took everything from us. Now you're going to become one of them. Nami turned to Najiko with an unreadable expression. Pirates, real pirates, are adventurers of the sea, seekers of all life has to offer. Arlong and his goons, Don Krieg and his fleet, Buggy and his circus of clowns are nothing more than criminal scum murdering, raping, and destroying everything in their path. They do nothing but give pirates a bad name. The younger sister grasped the older's shoulders firmly, reassuringly. I'm still me, Najiko. I still love tangerines and money to a, let's be honest, worryingly crippling degree. Understatement of the century. Najiko snorted in response, laughter slipping through the cracks. I will be an adventurer of the seas, a pirate, not a tyrannical dictator hell-bent on ruining anyone weaker than me. Well, anyone who picks a fight with my family and actually brings harm to us gets no mercy, but that shouldn't count. Najiko fell silent for a few moments before sighing in resignation. Nami was going to be a pirate no matter what she said, so she might as well just support her. The older woman smiles tenderly at her dear sister, spreading her arms, inviting Nami in for a hug. The navigator is quick to accept there before their mother's grave. The two embraced tearfully as the realization of freedom had finally sunk in. And that soon they would be apart again. Life on the high seas was an endless adventure with twists and turns some may never see coming. It was a life full of excitement, freedom. But most of all danger. To be on the seas you needed to be ready to pull the trigger, and Najiko wasn't one to do so. Her dreams, her desires didn't require her to leave the safety of her home. All she wanted was right here on the Konami Islands. At least for now. Perhaps in the future she too may want to sail the waters her sister sought, but for now, the land is where she belongs. Nami's eyes fluttered open and her arms around her sister slackened as she turned towards the waters, towards the port. Nami. What is it? What's wrong? Najiko asked, eyeing her sister with worry. The smile that spread across Nami's face did little to alleviate Najiko's distress because of the gleam in the navigator's gaze. So that's the twisted gaze. Nothing's wrong. Nami replied, starting her trek back to the village with a skip in her step. It's just that the guest of honor has finally arrived. Guest of honor? Najiko looked even more confused before Nami turned back to her with that spine-chilling manic gaze. Arlong's executioner. Sanji could only shake his head at the immaturity of it all. Cooking for the whole of Kokoyashi village had been a simultaneously enlightening and hectic experience. There had been a lot of indigenous fauna that Sanji had only been able to read about. Apparently Arlong had put a rather ludicrous increase in prices for them that even the old geezer wasn't willing to pay for. That wasn't the immature part though. The immaturity was the so-called vice captain, Mr. Merimo himself, laughing his ass off alongside the crew's resident liar while their captain was being shaken around by his coat. The Wolfman had been doing great in escaping his grandfather's clutches, only to have slipped when he got too cocky in making his dramatic, mere millimeter-away evasions from Garp. The captain slipped and lost his footing after trying to do a backflip into a cartwheel for his latest stunt. The wolf within was in a much more sour mood than the Straw Hat's cook, however, as the lands he inhabited had begun shaking violently. The extent of how long the shaking had been going on was enough to make the undisputed king of canines sick to his stomach and absolutely livid with his host and host's grandfather. Luffy, I swear to gods I will kill your grandfather for this. Luffy would have mentally talked shit with the wolf had he had enough functioning facilities to even do so. As it was now, the combination of vigorous shaking and screaming from both Garp and Genzo had disoriented the poor wolfman so much his eyes were swirls. A white flag was basically being waved erratically as the Straw Hat's captain looked to be mere moments away from puking his guts out. The vice admiral stopped the vigorous shaking, however, once the presence of a certain acquaintance of his entered his hockey range. Old Genzo paused in his screaming as well when he noticed the shift in Garp's behavior. Luffy himself noticed a bit later. If he hadn't had his brain knocked around his skull like a bouncy ball, the wolfman likely would have picked up on the guest of honor's presence even sooner than Garp had. Zoro and the rest of the Straw Hats had yet to sense the long-awaited guest, but from their captain's reaction alone they had an idea of what was about to happen. The village remained oblivious, however, and continued on with their celebration. The festivities came to an abrupt halt as something shot out the sea and landed on the port. It was a fishman, a blue-skinned fishman in an embroidered martial arts uniform, his long curly hair tied up in a knot. The fishman was rather large and on the chunky side at first glance, but the Straw Hats could sense the raw strength the fishman kept hidden behind well, they weren't really sure how to interpret his expression. On one hand he might have been sporting a look of barely repressed anger, on the other he might just have the most moody, angry at the world teenager's resting bitch face. Luffy wagered it was the former, as the fishman's eyes were brimming with unchained fury. Now the Straw Hats had mostly been observing the fishman. The villagers. They were focused on the otherworldly beauty that was the mermaid who had apparently accompanied the martial artist. Of course, once Sanji caught sight of her, the flirting was only moments away from bursting forth. Zoro cursed himself for not considering keeping the cook's eyes covered, but a look around the villagers showed how little it would have mattered. While the women seemed to have the sense to at least be somewhat wary of the strangers, the men were unapologetically ogling the shark mermaid who, thankfully, didn't seem to notice. Luckily for the swordsman, Nami arrived just in time to identify the newcomers and, more importantly to Zoro, slam Sanji into the dirt with a swift hockey-coated fist. If it isn't the fishman we've all been waiting for. The blue fishman turned to Nami and tensed, guilt blooming in his eyes. Clearly the fishman had been told what happened to her specifically. The Knight of the Sea, captain of the Sun Pirates, sworn brother of the Konami Island's Bane, one of the 7 warlords himself, Jinbei. Nami's voice reached every one of the villagers' ears. The men had snapped out of their stupor and regained some semblance of cognitive function as they glared at the warlord. From his place, restrained against a boulder, Arlong stared in utter shock and disbelief at the newcomers. His focus wasn't on his sworn brother Jinbei, but the shark mermaid who choked out a sob when her eyes found his. The tyrant began struggling against his restraints once more, eyeing the villagers he'd tormented for years as if they were actual threats for once. He didn't seem to be afraid for himself though. Luffy and Zoro had come to stand by Nami's side as Jinbei and the mermaid walked towards them. The warlord shared a glance with Garp, silently begging that what he'd been told was exaggerated. That his sworn brother hadn't actually sunk so far down to have committed the atrocities that shook the warlord down to his very core. Fate was a cruel mistress, however, and Garp's hard look in response caused the Knight of the Sea to appear as if he'd aged decades more. Only a meter away from Nami, Jinbei stood still, before getting on his knees and pressing his forehead harshly against the rough earth. What Arlong has done can never be excused. His actions disgust not only myself but all of my crew and the royal family of the Fishman Kingdom as well. I only ask no, I beg. I beg that you not seek revenge against the people of the sea. The warlord knew he was in no position to be asking for such a request, but he had to try. For the innocents who had no involvement in this and for the future his dearly departed older brother sought, he would give anything. Anything. If Arlong's death is not enough, I offer my own as well. Silence greeted the warlord's declaration. Arlong wasn't struggling anymore. His mind had yet to come to terms with what he was hearing. The mermaid with Jinbei looked much the same, but there was more despair in her eyes. Even the notion of the warlord's death seemed to push her to tears. Her beautiful cerulean eyes find Nami's, begging the young human to not claim Jinbei's life. Fate was a cruel mistress, but she wasn't interested in claiming the whale shark fishman's life just yet. Clapping was the last thing Jinbei expected to hear. The warlord certainly wasn't expecting the whole village to be doing so, following Nami's lead as the young human woman smiled brightly at him. The navigator's eyes were bright yet somehow solemn. Your life won't come to an end today, Knight of the Sea. Nami declared as the villagers behind her began cracking smiles as well, taking swigs of their drinks. You seem confused. He most certainly was. Jinbei was fully prepared to have his head severed from his neck, not be treated to a round of applause and smiles. Nami simply gestured towards Luffy before continuing. My dear Lu here, has been more than adamant about your character. Unlike your disappointment of a brother, you're apparently quite honorable and just. The Wolfman didn't seem to appreciate the nickname and glared at his fiancée, who ignored him, as well as Zoro, who couldn't help but snort at his captain's expense. I've also been told about your goals. Your dream. I want to see it come to fruition as well. Both the fishmen and the mermaid were left dumbfounded. Screw an execution, this was a bloody miracle. Honestly, it was too good to be true. Jinbei internally began wondering if Pops had bonked him on the head a bit too hard after their last chat about Ace running off to find Teach. Of course we wanted to see if it was all true, and well, you certainly delivered. Nami said with a happy smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. The navigator was glad that Jinbei seemed to be exactly as Luffy claimed, but that didn't erase the seed of hate Arlong had planted in her heart the day he claimed her mother's life. Nami would likely never be rid of the seed. But at least she could grow to accept fishmen and even befriend them. Hachi's kindness throughout the years already showed her that the people of the depths weren't all monsters. The village and I have all agreed to not hold the actions of one psychopath on the lives of all other fishfolk. So like I said, your life won't be claimed today, Jinbei. The warlord felt like he'd been let off too easily. Yes, he was glad the villagers wouldn't hold it against the innocents of Fishman Island, but he couldn't accept just being forgiven that easily. It was true that the corrupt marines of this branch withheld the information about Arlong, but he should have been more thorough. If he had, the woman before him might never have been enslaved. She might have actually gotten to grow up with her mother. I thank you, truly, but I cannot accept being forgiven so easily, Jinbei finally said, staring back at Nami with unflinching resolution. I must atone for Arlong's transgressions. There must be something you wish for? The navigator smirked inwardly. This was the true test. All I ask is that you follow through on your deal with Arlong. He has violated it after all. Claim his life with your own hands. Jinbei didn't even blink. Ask for something else, Miss Nami. The navigator's smile dipped slightly, the villagers bristling as well. Ask me something I had no plans of doing in the first place. The mermaid turned away from Jinbei, tears freely streaming down her face now, knowing fate would claim Arlong's life by night's end. Now it was the villagers' turn to be dumbfounded. Nami recovered quickly, however, and firmly put Jinbei on her list of trustworthy and respected individuals. The identity of the crying mermaid was beginning to pique her interest though. Who's she? Jinbei tensed before turning to the mermaid with an encouraging nod. The humans put their faith in him, he felt it only right he put his faith in them as well. The mermaid wiped away her tears and composed herself before identifying herself. Forgive me. My name is Shirley. I own a quaint little cafe down in Fishman Island. I am Arlong's younger sister. Silence. After the musicians made that horrible sound on their instruments that universally translated to wait, what? Jinbei began to sweat nervously as even Luffy and Garp seemed stupefied. Perhaps because she was Arlong's flesh and blood they'd seek her death as well? Contrary to Jinbei's fears, however, the humans, all the humans, Nami included, only stared at Shirley, who fidgeted nervously under the attention. Then they turned to Arlong. Then Shirley again, then Arlong. Younger sister? Sanji murmured, blinking uncomprehendingly as the rather gruff Arlong and back at the beauty that was Shirley. Yes, Shirley wasn't sure how to interpret their strange behavior. Jinbei on the other hand recognized the confusion, and wasn't sure if he wanted to laugh, cry or groan in exasperation. You're a mermaid. Luffy stated bluntly. Shirley nodded in response. He's a fishman. Another nod. Your siblings? Like blood-related siblings? Yes. Shirley wasn't sure where the human was going with this. Again it was back to the gazes being from her to Arlong, back to back, again and again. Eventually Jinbei just sighed and pushed the wheelchair Shirley was on towards Arlong. The villagers, while still very confused, knew what was about to go down and respectfully gave the fishfolk space. Only Nami, Luffy and Zoro followed behind the warlord and mermaid. Arlong wasn't close enough to have heard the exchange between Jinbei and the human scum, so he only glared at his sworn brother scornfully. Thinking that he'd be even more in Jinbei's debt irked him to no end. One thing didn't click in his mind though. If Jinbei was here to set him free, why was Shirley brought along for the ride? It wasn't like he was one of those older brothers who bowed down to their sister's whims. The confusion in his sworn brother's eyes was clear as day, and with an expression like he'd been through 2 full-blown wars, Jinbei said, "I thought it only right Shirley get to see her older brother before his life came to an end." The tyrant of the Konami Islands could not say anything to that, even if he wasn't gagged. Thus he only stared at his sworn brother in listless shock while Shirley sobbed on his shoulder, knowing after today, Arlong would never breathe again. So there they stood. After all their years watching each other's backs, looking up to and idolizing their fallen hero, bickering over conflicting ideologies, they now stood against each other. One on his knees, battered into submission, the other tired and weary, as if the weight of the world had come to rest upon his shoulders. Luffy and Zoro stood by Arlong's side, keeping the fishman firmly in place. The swordsman's focus wasn't entirely on his prisoner though. Luffy wasn't exactly being subtle with his constant glancing towards the forest that Garp disappeared into. Zoro knew it wasn't anything hostile, he couldn't pick up any killing intent from the woods after all. Yet the swordsman wasn't entirely sure what his captain had zeroed in on. Unlike the rest of the crew, Zoro's observation haki wasn't as detailed or concise. He knew Garp was there from the massive hurricane of power the crazy old geezer didn't bother hiding. He could also tell there was a lot of life in the forest but not what they were. Guess I'll just have to wait and see. Nami had come to the same conclusion as Zoro. Even from the sidelines next to Shirley, the Orangeette could tell her captain seemed to put a lot of attention to the woods. Unfortunately, like Zoro, she had no idea what was in the woods. Kind of. She could actually tell what was in the woods. A nest of chicks on the tree by Dr. Nako's clinic. A family of raccoons raiding Steve's garbage bin. She could even see the mantises having a turf war by the far side of the forest. What did all those things have in common? They weren't swallowed up by the walking disaster that was her grandfather-in-law. Garp started calling her that right after he seemed to be cured of having flashbacks of a certain woman. Any last words, Arlong? Jinbei asked, already preparing to deliver the blow that would end his brother's life. This would haunt him for the rest of his days, but Jinbei believed he could only blame himself for that. The humans may have forgiven him, but he wasn't sure he could ever even forgive himself for his blunder. The sawtooth shark fishman glared with pure disdain at his sworn brother. What you fight for, what you wish for is nothing more than the dreams of naive peace-loving cowards. This equality you seek is nothing more than a pipe dream that will get you and everyone else you drag along the way into early graves. Just like our fallen queen, Odahime. Jinbei was absolutely livid, but he restrained himself into only intensifying his spiteful glare. Arlong, the sensation and idol of many young fishmen deep in the depths, the one to spread and advocate most of fishman's supremacy, stayed true to himself until the very end. At least that's how he expected himself to go out. Before Jinbei could proceed with the execution, Luffy intervened. Not so fast, Jinbei. There's one more person who wants to pay Arlong a visit. Confusion spread amongst everyone there before they turned their sights to the forest. The rambunctious jovial laughter of Garp the Fist catching their attention. The old vice admiral had returned, with company in tow. A tall blonde man with a top hat bearing goggles walked alongside Garp in a long black jacket with a buckle on the left sleeve, with a blue shirt and vest, a frilled cravat, and a simple belt holding a pair of loosened light blue pants with black boots, and Orangeette with a crimson newsboy cap with goggles, a pink shirt with a frilly collar, a short maroon skirt, black thigh-high stockings with brown high-heeled boots on the other. Zoro and Shirley hadn't the faintest clue who the newcomers were, but Nami recognized the man from Luffy's stories. Sabo, Arlong and Jinbei had their eyes on the woman, however, familiarity and recognition tickling the back of their minds. The two weren't sure where they'd seen the orange-haired woman before until they saw her eyes, and the memories of a young child with dirty blonde hair flashed through their eyes. Jinbei could only stare, completely caught off guard by the little girl from all those years ago slowly making her way towards him now. Arlong wasn't in his stupor for long, as he snarled at the young woman. Coughing into a closed fist rather loudly, Garp gestured towards his companions as he introduced them. These two here are revolutionaries. Patting Sabo on the back, he identified the blonde man as, "This cheeky brat is Sabo, chief of staff in the Revolutionary Army, that is to say, their second in command next to Dragon." Sabo would have bowed respectfully towards the others present, but at the moment he was dusting himself off after being sent face first into the dirt. Ignoring the blonde's death glare, Garp rested his hand atop the woman's head as if she was one of his nieces. "And this young lady goes by the name Koala, a high-ranking officer in the Revolutionary Army who advocates for equality amongst the people of the land and the sea." The revelation wasn't exactly one that anyone on the beach could just sweep under the rug. Nami could only turn to Luffy with a look of, "Seriously?" To which her fiancé just shrugged and smirked. He wasn't exaggerating when he said his gramps had a habit of dropping bombshells like those without a care. The fishmen were too caught up on the fact that the sweet little koala, or the annoying rundy shit as Arlong referred to her as mentally, was a revolutionary, fighting for equality. The combination of her appearance as well as her career choice was, as it turns out, very potent in sending the two fishmen down rabbit holes so deep they didn't even question why such high-priority targets would be walking around willy-nilly alongside a marine. Zoro wasn't though. If these two have such high positions in the Revolutionary Army, why aren't they under arrest? The response promoted the swordsman to facepalm in exasperation, while Nami began to seriously worry about how her future child might turn out. Shirley wasn't sure what to make of the response at first, before shaking her head with an amused smirk as King Neptune might have been no different. Why would I arrest my grandson? He hasn't even been identified by those lazy schmucks in their ivory towers or the government as revolutionaries. Garp replied while picking his nose with his pinky, as the monkey D's do. Far as I'm concerned, this cheeky brat is just visiting with his girlfriend. Just how lax are you? Nami and Zoro scream internally as the Vice Admiral grinned cheekily down at Sabo. The revolutionary just gave him a dull look, knowing the old geezer just wanted to get a rise out of him. The two stood next to Nami and shyly with Sabo standing right next to the navigator. Under other circumstances, Koala would have reacted bashfully and began acting like the embarrassed anime girl people love and hate. Now weren't other circumstances though. With a sad smile on her face, Koala approached the two brothers. One cared for her and looked after her like she was one of his own. The other never bothered hiding his disdain for her race, but still kept her under his wing in his own twisted way. Jinbei was still at a loss for words by the time Koala arrived by his side, but Arlong certainly wasn't. Come to revel in another fishman's execution? Arlong sneered with his sea king-like eyes, but Koala didn't even flinch. The young woman just kneeled before him, and what she said next, yep, you guessed it, shocked him. Lots of stupefaction is going round today. I'm sorry. Jinbei was ready to break Arlong's nose off after his rude remark, but he too was once again silenced by shock as Koala apologized. I didn't know at the time that my village had plotted to kill Fisher Tiger. I didn't find out for a long time and I didn't have any involvement in reporting his presence, but even so I'm sorry. The sands beneath her began to darken, tears streaming down her face and crashing against the beach as she continued. You all took me in after I'd escaped the Celestials. You brought me back from the brink and reminded me what it was like to live again. To be a person again. You fishmen helped restore the sanity of the little human girl. Despite everything humans had done, you all still took me in and helped me get back on my feet. Why are you crying? Why are you shedding tears for fishmen? Arlong screams internally as even more things he believed with all his heart came into question. Humans were scum. Humans were an inferior race, only superior to fishmen through the sheer number of them. Humans chained the fishmen down and toyed with them. Humans destroyed everything they could. Humans weren't supposed to care about anything but themselves. They weren't supposed to be capable of love, of compassion. They were evil, they had to be. But as more tears were spilled for his people, more cracks spread across Arlong's resolve. Cracks he'd thought sealed shut forever after the betrayal that led to Fisher Tiger's death. Cracks made towards the end of their journey to Koala's home. Fisher Tiger would be alive if it weren't for me. Koala's admission to what Arlong had blamed her for so long, should have made him ecstatic. Instead he was begging for her to stop as more and more of his resolve for what he'd stood for crumbled away. If it weren't for me, you might have been able to finally get past the illusions you had about humanity. You might have never come here to the east and wrecked the atrocities that sealed your fate. Stop, please don't, please stop. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. This wasn't how the world worked. Humans weren't capable of this. They were cruel, selfish, corrupt bastards who crushed anything weaker than themselves. I can't promise it will be anytime soon. I definitely won't pull it off by year's end, but I swear it will be done. A blazing wildfire of resolve burned through the tears. Humans, fishmen, giants, and any other intelligent species, there will be no more prejudice, no more inequality amongst them. I won't rest until I can say without a doubt that no one, no matter the race, will ever go through what you and others have gone through. This is my ambition, my dream, my penance and retribution for Fisher Tiger's death. With a choking sob, Koala launched herself into Arlong and hugged him tightly. I only wish you were there to see it. Arlong was ready to scoff and sneer at the young revolutionary, building his walls of denial once more. Those walls collapsed, however, the moment he actually got to see Koala. Scars. Scars were everywhere on her body that he could see, and some disappeared into her clothes. He knew these scars. They were battle scars, but those weren't what caught his eye. No, it was the scars and marks he saw on Jinbei, on Kurobe, on Fisher Tiger. Koala was never identified and given a wanted poster, but that doesn't mean she hasn't made waves. Garp spoke up from his spot on the sidelines, giving an irate Sabo a noogie. But she has already gotten an epithet ready for when they finally do snag a decent enough photo. Koala, the maelstrom. Jinbei's eyes widened even more as he recognized the epithet, but more importantly, the implications. The first human to master fishman karate, and to the level where our warlord here should be ready to sacrifice an arm if he plans on winning. Memories of all the blood, sweat and tears Jinbei went through to reach the level he was now flooded Arlong's mind. The harsh training Jinbei endured to become stronger so he could be like Fisher Tiger and protect others. The sacrifices he made, destroying himself months at a time as he continued pressing forward, beyond his limits. All those memories flashed through Arlong's eyes, and soon they were replaced with an image of a young koala trying to do the same. A human, sacrificed this much, to show how far she was willing to go. Humans were frailer than fishmen. That was a fact that could not be denied. It was that fact that made Koala's accomplishments that much greater. It was that fact that completely destroyed Arlong's already crumbling beliefs. The shark fishman never thought he'd regret choices he made when it came to how he treated humans, but there was a first for everything after all. Arlong's resolve, beliefs and misconceptions were all washed away, but the cleanse came way too late. Perhaps in a different life, he might have been able to see when fishmen children were able to mingle and laugh with the humans in those wondrous parks he saw back on Saboti. With a trembling sniffle, Koala removed herself from Arlong, who just looked lost in thought, his expression a mix of anger, wistfulness, resignation, and regret. Jinbei wasn't any better than Koala as the reminder that he was to execute his sworn brother came crashing down on his shoulders once again. But Jinbei was a fishman of his word, and for his incompetence, this was his penance. Steeling himself, Jinbei returned to preparing to deliver the killing blow. It would be a swift death. Nami wasn't so sadistic that she wished Arlong's torture by his sworn brother's hand, so she was the one to suggest it be ended in one hit. Speaking of the navigator, Nami found herself consoling Shirley, who was struggling to keep her eyes on the execution. A strange twist of fate. The victim consoling the murderer's sister for her brother's execution. Just as a son doesn't bear the sins of the father, the sister shouldn't be blamed for her brother's atrocities. Nami said to herself, deep down praying she didn't have to. Try as she might, being rid of her disdain of fishmen wasn't happening anytime soon. Nami could only hope her misplaced anger with them faded completely by the time Jinbei would join their ranks. Any last words, brother? Jinbei asked Arlong once more as Koala made her way back to Garp and Sabo, her fellow revolutionary moving to comfort her before she was even meters away. Arlong blinked as he was taken away from his dreaming. It was nice. Humans, fishmen, and all other races of the world living together and enjoying the joys of the world. Arlong smirked wryly as he realized just how much he actually wished to see it. I hated humans so much, but look where that got me. In the end, I was no different. Arlong shifted his focus to the audience in the sidelines, and locked eyes with Nami. Ah, I did hurt her the most, didn't I? Nothing left to say, Arlong? I'm sorry, Nami. The navigator froze as her mind tried to register what she was hearing. Maybe if things were different, we could have been friends, real friends, and seen the day everyone just got along. The navigator was taken aback by the genuinity in Arlong's eyes. But the sight only lasted a few seconds. With his eyes closed tight, Jinbei gathered, focused and condensed gallons of water into a fine little speck as the edge of his fist and punch. There was no pain. There wasn't a brain to process it. Sawtooth fishman Arlong died and his sister cried in anguish as his headless corpse thumped lifelessly against the rough sand.